There is a book the Bible itself points to, and yet most people have never truly encountered it. Tucked inside the pages of Scripture is a reference so startling that, once you notice it, you cannot easily forget it. In Joshua 10:13, after one of the most staggering miracles ever described in human history, the day the sun stood still in the sky and the moon seemed to wait in silence, the text pauses and asks a haunting question. Is this not written in the Book of Jasher? In that single line, the Bible does something extraordinary. It quotes another book. It gestures beyond its own immediate page and points the reader toward an ancient record, a witness from the deep past, a lost testimony that once stood close enough to sacred history to be known, cited, and trusted. That moment feels less like a footnote and more like the sudden opening of a hidden door. What kind of book must this have been for Joshua itself to name it? What weight did it carry? What memory did it preserve? What stories did it hold that the writers of Scripture expected their readers to recognize? The Book of Jasher has long stirred the imagination because it appears not as a rumor or a legend invented centuries later, but as something Scripture itself assumes already existed. It is not introduced with suspicion. It is not dismissed. It is referenced with a kind of quiet confidence, as though those who first heard these words would have understood exactly what was being invoked. And that is what makes it so compelling. This was not merely some forgotten text drifting at the edges of faith. At one time, it appears to have been known well enough that its name needed no explanation. The mystery deepens because the Book of Jasher is mentioned again, this time in 2 Samuel 1:18, when David, crushed by grief over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, lifts up a lament so beautiful, so piercing, and so drenched in sorrow that it has echoed through the centuries with undiminished force. And once again, the text points outward. This also, it says, is written in the Book of Jasher. 2 references, 2 moments of enormous significance, one tied to cosmic miracle, the other to royal grief. One tied to a day when time itself seemed to bend, the other to a song of mourning that has survived 3,000 years. These are not casual mentions. They are citations. They suggest that the biblical writers and their audiences lived within a larger world of sacred memory, one in which the Book of Jasher occupied a meaningful place. And yet, for generation after generation, it seemed to vanish. It became a shadow behind the text, a name without a body, a title without pages. People knew the references, but not the work itself. The book lingered in the imagination of believers as something half-remembered, almost mythical, a lost chronicle from the earliest ages of the world, whispering from behind the curtain of history. That disappearance only fed the fascination. Why would a book named in Scripture fall into obscurity? Why would something treated seriously by the biblical record itself slip from common knowledge and become a mystery? For many, the answer has always felt unsettling, because the Book of Jasher has been imagined not merely as an old document, but as a fuller telling of the human story, one that lingers over the details, one that names the wounds, one that refuses to smooth the sharp edges of flawed people trying to walk with a holy God. The name itself carries a gravity that deepens the intrigue. Jasher is often understood not as the name of a single person, but as a title meaning the upright or the just. In Hebrew tradition, it evokes those who walked in sincerity before the Lord, those who stood out in a corrupt world not because they were flawless, but because they turned their faces toward God instead of away from Him. That meaning matters, because it suggests the book was not simply a random historical record. It was remembered as a chronicle of the upright, a testimony about the lives, struggles, failures, and faith of those who shaped the earliest story of redemption. It calls to mind names like Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Joshua, men whose lives were marked not by perfection, but by encounter, obedience, collapse, repentance, and grace. What makes the Book of Jasher so arresting in the imagination is the sense that it does not present biblical figures as distant icons frozen in stained glass. It pulls them down into the dust and blood of real life. It imagines them breathing, trembling, wrestling, fearing, praying, and enduring. It does not flatten them into symbols. It remembers them as human beings. Adam is not merely the first man in a theological summary. He is a man exiled from Eden, walking into a world suddenly stripped of innocence, carrying the unbearable memory of what was lost. Eve is not only the first woman, she is the mother of grief, the mother of pain, the mother who knows what it means to see death enter the family through her own son. Cain is not merely a warning. Abel is not merely a victim. Their story becomes flesh, motive, jealousy, anger, rupture. The line of Seth and the line of Cain become more than names in a genealogy. They become diverging paths in the human soul, righteousness and rebellion intertwining across generations. And then comes Enoch, that mysterious figure who walked with God and was taken without seeing death. In most people's reading of Genesis, Enoch appears and disappears almost before the mind can settle on him. But in the larger traditions surrounding Jasher, he becomes a figure of astonishing spiritual weight, a man lifted by intimacy with God above the corruption of his age. Noah, too, becomes more than the builder of an ark and the survivor of the flood. He becomes a preacher of warning, a witness of patience, a man enduring mockery for decade after decade while building salvation in plain sight of a world too arrogant to believe judgment could ever come. The ark itself becomes more than an image for children's books. It becomes a monument to obedience in the face of universal disbelief. After the flood, the story widens again. The earth is divided, nations rise. Nimrod emerges as a mighty ruler, a hunter, a man of force and ambition, a symbol of human power organized against divine authority. Babel is no longer just a sentence or two about pride and confusion. It becomes a picture of civilization straining upward in defiance, brick upon brick, humanity trying once more to seize heaven on its own terms. The tower is not only architecture, it is rebellion embodied. And when God descends and scatters language, he is not acting out of insecurity, but judgment. He is exposing the futility of human greatness built without humility, without reverence, without truth. Then the narrative turns toward Abraham, and here the imagination of Jasher becomes especially vivid. Abraham is not introduced merely as the father of faith, but as a young man already at war with falsehood. He is portrayed as one who looks at the idols around him and sees the absurdity of men bowing to what their own hands have shaped. He questions what others accept. He refuses to fear the silence of dead gods. In that refusal, he becomes dangerous to the order of his world, and so the tyrant's rage rises. According to the old tradition, Abraham is cast into a furnace, condemned for rejecting idolatry, and yet the flames cannot consume him. Fire becomes the setting for revelation. Judgment becomes the stage for deliverance. The God Abraham trusts proves himself greater than empire, greater than fear, greater than death itself. That is the pattern that follows him through every season of his life. The leaving of homeland, the long road of promise, the famine, the wars, the rescue of Lot, the ache of delay, the bitter confusion of trying to understand a promise that seems to move slower than pain. And then, at last, Isaac, the miracle child, the impossible child, the son born when both Abraham and Sarah had already crossed into the humanly hopeless. In a bare summary, one can say that Isaac was born as the fulfillment of God's promise. But in a fuller telling, the birth becomes laughter after decades of tears, joy after long humiliation, proof that divine timing is not the same as human impatience. And when the terrible command comes, the mountain, the wood, the altar, the knife, the story opens Yaupa. Abraham does not become less human because he obeys. He becomes more agonizingly human. Faith is no longer abstract. It costs. It wounds. It asks. It does not always explain itself. Isaac, too, is no longer a silent figure in the background. He becomes part of the mystery of trust, part of the unbearable beauty of surrender, until heaven intervenes and the God who tests also provides. The same richness follows the generations that come after, Isaac and Jacob, Jacob and Esau. Joseph betrayed, sold, humiliated, forgotten, then lifted from prison to power in Egypt. These stories are already powerful in Genesis and Exodus, but when retold in a more expansive voice, they gain texture, breadth, emotional weight. Joseph's suffering is not a quick sequence of plot points, it is a long schooling in providence. Moses is not only the lawgiver of stone and thunder, but a reluctant man, burdened by calling, carrying doubt and obedience in the same heart. The plagues are not mere symbols, they become judgments that invade the natural world with terrifying force. The Nile turns not merely red but unusable, defiled, thick with death. Frogs do not merely appear, they overrun every boundary, humiliating the illusion of Egyptian control. Darkness becomes a palpable thing, pressing against homes, swallowing firelight, announcing that the God of Israel can unmake the cosmos when he chooses. Then comes the Passover, that terrible and holy night when death moved through Egypt and only the blood marked out a place of mercy. Then the sea. The Red Sea is one of the great dividing lines in sacred imagination, because it is the moment when escape becomes impossible and God makes a way anyway. In an expanded telling, the waters do not simply part as a neat miracle, they tower, they tremble. They stand by command, as though the whole created order has paused to serve its maker's purpose. Israel crosses not through a trick of tide or weather, but through a corridor carved by divine authority. Egypt charges in after them, still drunk on power, and the same path of deliverance becomes a path of judgment. That is the kind of story Jasher evokes again and again. The God who saves and the God who judges are not two different beings. They are one and the same Holy Lord, patient beyond measure, and yet never unjust. The wilderness deepens that pattern. The people murmur, fear, rebel, forget, repent, fail, and are sustained anyway. The golden calf becomes the shameful image of how quickly redeemed people can trade glory for something visible and controllable. The broken tablets are not merely broken stone, they are a sign of covenant shattered by unbelief. The 40 years are not a meaningless delay, but a long exposure of the human heart. One generation dies under the weight of its own refusal to trust, while another rises under the stern mercy of God. Through it all, divine faithfulness remains the unbroken thread. He does not disappear because his people are inconsistent. He does not revoke his character because they cannot hold on to theirs. He remains who he is, just, merciful, near, holy, patient and terrible in splendor. And finally the story reaches Joshua. Moses is gone. The mantle has fallen. The Jordan lies ahead. Beyond it stands the promised land. Not as a poetic idea, but as contested ground full of walls, armies, kings and fear. Joshua carries not only command but memory. He remembers Egypt. He remembers Sinai. He remembers the wilderness. He remembers the words spoken over him. Be strong and courageous. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. In that promise, history moves forward again. The Jordan yields. Jericho falls. Battle follows battle. Promise turns into conflict, and inheritance must be taken step by step. This is no sentimental version of faith. It is faith under pressure. Faith carrying a sword. Faith marching through exhaustion. Faith that must act before it sees. And then comes the day unlike any other. The day history itself seems to tremble. The day 5 kings gather to crush Israel. The day Joshua marches through the night to meet an enemy too strong and a battle too urgent to delay. The fighting rages. The light begins to fail. Victory hangs in the balance. And in that moment Joshua does not offer a timid wish. He does not whisper a private hope. He speaks with the ferocious boldness of someone who believes that the Lord of heaven is not distant, not symbolic, not asleep, but actively sovereign over all creation. He commands the sun over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon to stand still. And according to the biblical record, they do. The day lengthens. Time itself seems arrested beneath the hand of God. The sky refuses to move. Light remains. Israel prevails. Hailstones fall from heaven. The battlefield becomes a theater of divine intervention, so astonishing, that Scripture itself seems to pause in reverent wonder. And there, in the middle of that wonder, comes the line that refuses to leave us. Is this not written in the Book of Jasher? That question does more than cite a source. It invites the reader to recognize that the miracle belonged to a remembered tradition, a preserved testimony, a written witness outside the immediate narrative. It tells us that the day the sun stood still was not imagined in isolation, but recorded, remembered, and transmitted. It tells us there were once other pages, other scrolls, other sacred memories, moving alongside the books we now hold. It tells us that the world of the Bible was larger, richer, and more textually alive than many modern readers ever realize. That is why the Book of Jasher continues to fascinate believers, historians, skeptics, and seekers alike. Not because it replaces Scripture, and not because it stands above it, but because it appears in the shadow of Scripture like an echo from a deeper chamber of memory. It feels like the sound of old doors opening. It feels like a reminder that the story of God and humanity has always been bigger than our neat summaries, bigger than our polished sermons, bigger than the fragments we often reduce it to. It reminds us that the men and women of the biblical world were not marble statues, but strugglers, worshippers, doubters, failures, survivors, and saints held together by the relentless faithfulness of God. So no, this does not feel like myth in the shallow sense. It does not feel like a decorative tale invented to fill the gaps. It feels like memory, ancient, difficult, reverent memory. It feels like the kind of record people preserve because something happened that they never wanted the generations after them to forget. A world where Eden was still close enough to be mourned. A world where judgment fell like floodwaters. A world where fire could not consume the one God had chosen. A world where the sea opened, the desert burned with divine presence. Walls collapsed at a shout, and on one unrepeatable day, the sun itself stopped in the sky, because a man prayed in absolute faith and heaven answered. This is the testimony of those who were there, those who saw with their own eyes, those who carried the memory in their bones and set it down in writing, so that we, thousands of years later, might still grasp one simple and unshakable truth. The God who once commanded the sun to stand still is the very same God who hears your prayers tonight. The miracles of old are not bedtime stories, not religious folklore, not fragile legends polished by time into something softer than truth. They are the remembered acts of a living God, moving through human history with power, mercy, judgment, and purpose. And faith, real faith, deep faith, faith that clings to God when the world is falling apart, still has the power to move heaven and earth. The Book of Jasher may have been hidden from many, but it was never truly lost. And tonight, we walk through its pages together, from the first man to the final battle, from Eden to the promised land, from ruin to redemption, from the first wound of sin to the first glimmers of restoration. So, close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the noise of the day fall away from you. What we are about to enter is not merely ancient history. It is the story of God and man, of rebellion and mercy, of judgment and grace, of heaven reaching down to earth. And it begins now. Chapter 2. Before the flood. In the beginning, when God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed into him the breath of life, the world was whole. It was unstained, unbroken, untouched by death. The earth did not groan under sorrow. The air carried no fear. The garden that God planted was not merely beautiful, it was alive with perfection, filled with trees heavy with fruit that never spoiled, rivers clear as crystal and bright as liquid glass, and a peace so deep that every breath felt like a blessing. Adam walked there in innocence, unashamed, unafraid, fully known, and in the cool of the day, God came near. There was no barrier between creator and creation, no veil, no distance, no fracture in the relationship. Heaven and earth touched freely. Adam did not hide from the voice of God. He welcomed it. He knew it. He lived in the unbroken nearness for which every human soul has been aching ever since. But innocence did not remain. The Book of Jasher moves quickly beyond the beauty of Eden and turns its gaze toward what came after, toward the exile, the silence, the first long steps into a world no longer shaped by ease, but by consequence. When Adam and Eve were driven from the garden, the gates of Eden closed behind them forever. A mighty angel stood guard at the entrance, and a flaming sword turned in every direction, blazing as a sign that the place they had lost could not be retaken by human longing, regret, or strength. And for the first time in their existence, they felt what sin had done. They felt cold, they felt hunger, they felt weakness, they felt the terror of separation. The world outside Eden was still God's creation, but now it resisted them. The ground was hard. The air was sharp. The light itself must have seemed different, dimmer somehow, burdened by what had changed. The Book of Jasher tells us that Adam wept for 7 days without ceasing. He had been given everything: life, peace, purpose, closeness with God, and in one act of disobedience he saw it all collapse. He could not fully comprehend the size of the ruin. He did not merely lose a place. He lost a state of being. He lost innocence. He lost ease. He lost the immediate presence of the one who had made him. Eve wept beside him, but her sorrow carried another kind of weight. She remembered the serpent's voice. She remembered the lie, the desire, the reach of her hand, the taste of the fruit, and the terrible knowledge that followed. She knew she had listened when she should have fled. She knew she had drawn her husband into the same rebellion. Their grief was not abstract. It was personal, intimate, suffocating, and yet, even there, God did not abandon them. He came to them, not because they deserved comfort, but because mercy moved toward them even in judgment. He did not leave them naked in their shame. He clothed them in garments of skin, covering what sin had exposed. That act, quiet as it seems, was the first great sign that grace would not disappear from the earth. Even after rebellion, God still covered. Even after the fall, he still approached. And he spoke a promise, mysterious and far-reaching, a word planted like a seed in the darkness of human failure. The serpent would bruise the heel of the woman's offspring, but that offspring would crush the serpent's head. Adam and Eve could not have understood the full weight of that promise, but they understood enough to hope. Somewhere in the future, through the line of this broken family, a Redeemer would come. Someone would undo what had been done. Someone would answer the wound with victory. Someone would restore what seemed lost beyond repair. That promise became the first light shining inside a ruined world. In time, Adam and Eve had children, and with them came both joy and another stage of sorrow. Their first son was Cain, and after him came Abel. Genesis gives us the broad shape of their story, but Jasher lingers over the heart of it. Abel was a keeper of sheep, gentle in spirit, faithful in his labor. Cain worked the ground, strong and driven, but something inside him had already begun to turn inward. When the time came to bring offerings before the Lord, both sons came forward, but not in the same spirit. Cain did not bring the first and best of what the earth had yielded. He brought what remained, what cost him little, what he could part with without feeling the loss. His offering carried the outward form of obedience, but none of the inward surrender that gives worship its meaning. It was duty without devotion. It was ritual without reverence. Abel, by contrast, brought the firstborn of his flock, the best he had, offered freely and sincerely, not because he was compelled, but because he loved the God who had given him everything. And God, who always sees deeper than the hand into the heart, received Abel's gift and rejected Cain's. That rejection revealed what had already been growing inside Cain. Instead of humbling himself, he hardened. Instead of asking what was wrong in him, he fixed his eyes on the one whose offering had been accepted. Jealousy darkened into resentment, and resentment into hatred. Jasher gives weight to the final exchange between the brothers. They stood together in the field, speaking of ordinary things of their parents, of the lost garden, of the offerings they had made, of life under the shadow of exile. But beneath the words, something violent was rising. Then, without warning, Cain struck. He took up a stone and brought it down against his brother, and Abel, the first righteous sufferer, fell to the earth. His blood spilled into the ground, and the earth itself, which had already been cursed through Adam, now received innocent blood for the first time. It was the birth of murder, and in that moment humanity crossed another terrible threshold. Sin had moved from disobedience to destruction. It had gone from reaching against God to slaughtering a brother. When God came to Cain, he did not begin with thunder, he began with a question: "Where is your brother?" But Cain had already entered the cold logic of sin. He lied, he deflected. He answered with contempt, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Yet nothing is hidden from the one who made the earth and hears the voice of blood crying out from it. Abel's death could not be buried in silence. The ground itself testified, so Cain was judged. The earth, which he had worked, would no longer yield to him in the same way. He would become a wanderer, a fugitive, restless under the weight of what he had done. Marked by judgment, driven by distance, he went eastward, away from the nearness of the Lord, into the land of Nod. There he built a city, he took a wife, he had children. His line multiplied and spread, but it did not walk in the fear of God. Jasher presents the line of Cain as gifted, inventive, energetic, and spiritually hollow. They built and forged and created. They shaped metal, crafted instruments, filled the earth with skill, culture, wealth, noise, and ambition. They learned how to make beautiful things without becoming beautiful souls. They discovered power without wisdom, pleasure without holiness, civilization without reverence. Their lives expanded outward, but not upward. They were productive, but not pure, brilliant, but not surrendered. And all of it, however impressive it appeared, rang empty because it was built without the Lord. Back where Adam and Eve still carried the ache of both sons, one dead, one banished, God gave them another child. His name was Seth. The Book of Jasher tells us that Seth bore the image of Adam not only in form, but in spirit. He was gentle where Cain had hardened, humble where Cain had swelled with pride, reverent where Cain had become defiant. Through Seth, a different line began to unfold, one marked not by perfection, but by remembrance. These descendants did not forget the garden. They did not forget the promise. They carried the memory of what had been lost and the hope of what God had said would one day be restored. From Seth came Enosh, and from Enosh came Kenan, and from Kenan came Mahalalel, and onward through the generations ran a quiet, shining thread of faith woven through the dark fabric of a fallen world. Then came Enoch, the seventh from Adam, and Jasher speaks of him with extraordinary reverence. He was not merely a believer in God. He was a man who walked with God so continuously, so intimately, that his whole life became a living conversation with heaven. He moved through the world with the awareness that another world was pressing close. He saw what others did not see. He listened when others were too distracted to hear. According to the ancient tradition, Enoch was given visions beyond ordinary human measure. He was shown the order of the heavens, the paths of the sun and moon, the fate awaiting the wicked, and the glory prepared for the righteous. He was taught mysteries of creation, the rebellion of angels, the corruption spreading through the earth, and the coming judgment that men in their arrogance could not yet imagine. And he wrote what he was shown, leaving behind words that would echo through generations as a witness that heaven had not gone silent. But Enoch's life on earth did not end as others did. When he was 365 years old, the Lord took him, not in the ordinary way of death, but by translation. He was simply gone, lifted from earth into the presence of God, because his life had pleased the one with whom he walked. The people searched for him, but they could not find him. The elders could only say, "He is not, for God took him." It was the first great sign that death did not hold absolute dominion over humanity. It was a glimpse, however brief, of another destiny of a day when the curse would no longer reign forever. Enoch's departure became a living prophecy. It testified that the story of man would not end only in dust. There was more beyond the grave than decay. There was communion yet to be restored. Yet while Enoch drew near to God, much of humanity was moving in the opposite direction. Jasher paints the contrast sharply. The descendants of Seth, the line that still remembered the Lord, lived apart, often in the heights, removed from the swelling corruption below. They taught their children the ways of God. They preserved prayer. They guarded memory. They clung to the promise of redemption like a lamp burning against a gathering storm. But the descendants of Cain filled the valleys and plains. Their lives glittered with movement and sensation. They built cities, they forged weapons, they made music, they celebrated pleasure. They danced beneath the stars as though freedom meant the absence of all restraint. Their culture was dazzling, but it was unmoored. It pulsed with appetite, but not with truth. And in time, that lower world began to exert a dangerous pull on the higher one. The sons of Seth looked down from the mountains and saw the daughters of Cain. They saw beauty without discernment, charm without covenant, desire untethered from holiness. What had once been separation began to weaken. What had once been guarded became vulnerable. The righteous line, which had preserved the name of the Lord across generations, began to drift toward compromise. They no longer saw intermingling as a spiritual danger, but as a harmless crossing of boundaries. Desire clouded judgment. The distinction between devotion and corruption blurred. And with that blurring came the next great collapse in the story of man. What had been kept apart began to merge. The fear of God began to thin. The corruption that had been concentrated in one line began to spread through both. The world was becoming crowded, powerful, inventive, and increasingly violent. Men still built, married, traded, feasted, and dreamed, but the moral center was rotting from within. This is how the world darkened before the flood, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, through compromise, pride, appetite, forgetfulness, and the slow erosion of reverence. One generation neglected what the previous one had treasured. One family loosened what their fathers had guarded. One heart at a time, humanity drifted further from the voice that had once walked with Adam in the garden. And yet even then, God was not absent. He was watching, he was measuring, he was patient, but not indifferent. The story was moving toward judgment, yes, but also toward preservation, because even in a world rushing toward ruin, the Lord was already preparing the one through whom a remnant would survive. They looked down and saw the daughters of Cain clothed in splendor, adorned with gold, bright with jewels, their beauty heightened by paint, ornament, and every outward art that could make corruption look desirable. They heard music rising from the valleys below, laughter spilling into the night, the irresistible pulse of a world that seemed to promise pleasure without consequence, freedom without restraint, delight without obedience. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the sons of Seth began to descend. The elders warned them with urgency, born of wisdom. They pleaded with them not to go down, not to mingle with those who had forgotten the Lord, not to trade holy remembrance for passing desire. They told them that if they left the mountain, they would not return the same. But youth rarely believes what wisdom can already see. The young men did not listen. One by one they went down, and one by one they took wives from among the daughters of Cain. And with that, the holy line was weakened. The distinction between those who remembered God and those who had abandoned him began to blur. From those unions came children who were neither anchored in righteousness nor fully given over to wickedness, but unstable, driven, restless, hungry for greatness, for power, for dominion. And with each passing generation, the knowledge of God dimmed further. Prayer became quieter. Altars fell into neglect. Worship thinned into memory, and memory into silence. Then came an even darker corruption. The Book of Jasher echoes what the Book of Enoch expands upon in fearful detail. There were heavenly beings, watchers appointed to observe humanity, to guard, to witness, to serve within the order established by God. But some of these watchers looked upon the daughters of men and were consumed by forbidden desire. They abandoned their holy station. They broke the boundary set for them. They descended to earth, took human wives, and from those unlawful unions came the Nephilim beings of unnatural greatness, terrible in strength, dreadful in appetite, monstrous in cruelty. They were not merely tall men or mighty warriors exaggerated by legend. They were a distortion, a violation, a living sign that creation itself was being torn out of order. Their presence warped the earth. They consumed everything before them: crops, flocks, herds, the labor of men, the fruit of the ground, and when those things no longer satisfied them, they turned on humanity itself. The weak became prey. The strong ruled by terror. Violence spread across the world like disease. Bloodshed became ordinary. Murder no longer shocked. Sorcery flourished. Enchantments and corrupt knowledge multiplied. The secrets the fallen watchers brought of metalwork, weaponry, seduction, warfare, hidden arts, and destructive powers were twisted into instruments of oppression. Civilization did not become wiser, it became more dangerous. Humanity was not ascending, it was unraveling. And when God looked upon the earth, he saw that the corruption had gone deep, not merely into action, but into thought itself. Every imagination of man's heart was bent toward evil continually. Jasher tells us that the Lord was not first described as angry, but grieved. That grief matters. It reveals the heart of the Creator. He had not made humanity out of contempt, but out of love. He had shaped them with his own hands, breathed into them his own breath, placed them in a world of beauty and purpose, and now they had become almost unrecognizable beneath the weight of rebellion. The earth, once meant to be filled with life, order, and worship, had become swollen with violence, lust, corruption, and desecration. But even in a world collapsing under the weight of its own wickedness, one man stood apart. His name was Noah. Noah was the great-grandson of Enoch, born into an age already tilting toward ruin. But he did not lean with it. He did not surrender to the spirit of his generation. He did not make peace with evil simply because evil had become normal. Jasher tells us that Noah was righteous, not because he was flawless, not because he never felt the pressure of living among the corrupt, but because he feared the Lord and walked in his ways. That distinction matters. Righteousness was not some cold perfection. It was reverence. It was obedience. It was choosing the path of God while the world mocked it. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and he raised them to know the God of their fathers, even as the world around them forgot his name. In an age of noise, he preserved truth. In an age of violence, he cultivated reverence. In an age of defiance, he taught submission to the living God. Then the word of the Lord came to him with terrifying clarity. The end of all flesh had come before God, because the earth was filled with violence, and judgment would fall not only upon mankind, but upon the world they had corrupted with their rebellion. Yet in the midst of that decree came grace. God said to Noah, in effect, that while destruction would come, Noah had found favor in his sight. He was to build an ark, a vessel of preservation in a world appointed for judgment. Noah did not argue. He did not ask for a more reasonable assignment. He did not shrink back because the command was strange. No rain had ever fallen in the way it soon would. No one had seen a flood that could cover the whole earth. To the natural mind, the instruction would have sounded absurd, but Noah obeyed because he trusted the voice that spoke it. The Book of Jasher says that Noah preached for 120 years while he built, day after day, year after year, he warned the people. He did not merely hammer wood in silence, he cried out to his generation. He urged them to repent. He called them to turn back before judgment arrived. He begged them to seek mercy while mercy could still be found. But they answered him with laughter. They mocked the old man building a massive vessel on dry ground. They pointed to the clear sky, the still rivers, the ordinary seasons, and took the absence of immediate judgment as proof that no judgment was coming at all. They mistook God's patience for weakness. They treated delay as denial. They looked at Noah's faith and called it madness. Yet Noah did not stop. He did not build according to human approval. He built according to the word of God. Plank by plank, beam by beam, cubit by cubit, he continued. His hands bled, his muscles ached. His years were spent in labor no one around him respected. But obedience rarely looks impressive to those who cannot see what is coming. At last the ark was finished, every board sealed with pitch, every chamber prepared, every measure completed exactly as God had commanded. Then the word came again. Noah was to enter the ark with his household, because in 7 days the rain would begin, and it would fall for 40 days and 40 nights. Noah entered, and with him entered his wife, his sons, and their wives. Then came the animals, not driven by man's force, but drawn by the strange obedience of creation itself. 2 by 2 they came, male and female of every kind that walked, flew, crept and breathed. It was as though the animal world understood what the human world refused to believe. Judgment was at the door, and then the ark was shut, not by Noah's hand, not by human strength, by God himself. The sealing of that door was more than a practical act. It was the closing of a final boundary between mercy received and mercy refused. Then the sky, which had remained clear for generations, began to darken. Chapter 3. The Great Flood. The Book of Jasher does not describe the flood as a storm in the ordinary sense. It describes it as the undoing of creation itself. On the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the appointed hour arrived. The fountains of the great deep burst open. Waters exploded from beneath the earth with violent force, as though the foundations of the world had cracked under the command of God. The ground split. Hidden reservoirs, buried since the earliest shaping of the earth, surged upward in roaring columns. At the same moment, the windows of heaven were opened, and rain began to fall, not the gentle, nourishing rain that softens soil and feeds crops, but relentless torrents, walls of water descending with such force that sight itself was swallowed. It was as though the heavens had become an ocean overturned upon the earth. Inside the ark, Noah and his family listened as judgment took hold of the world outside. They heard the pounding of water against the wood. They heard the groaning of the vessel under the pressure of the rising flood. They heard, too, the cries of those outside men, women, children, voices that had once laughed, now turned desperate, voices that had mocked, now begging to be saved. Jasher says they came to the ark, pounding on its walls, climbing its sides, clawing at the sealed entrance, confessing too late that Noah had spoken the truth. They begged for mercy. They promised repentance. They would have reversed their whole lives in a moment, if only the flood would pause long enough to let them in. But the door was sealed by God, and no human hand could open what he had shut. The same patience they had scorned had already run its course. The waters climbed faster than their repentance. One by one they were swept away, dragged beneath the roar of the deep, their cries swallowed by the judgment they had refused to believe. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain did not cease. The waters rose over the fields, then over the hills, then over the mountains themselves. Every living thing that breathed the air of the earth perished. Cities vanished. Trees disappeared beneath the swell. The works of men, their houses, towers, roads, altars to false gods, all of it disappeared under the waters. The world that had boasted in its own strength was reduced to silence. Only Noah and those with him in the ark remained alive. Jasher presents the ark not as a lucky refuge, but as a vessel held by the direct preserving hand of God. The waves rose like mountains, yet it did not overturn. The storm beat against it without mercy, yet it did not split. It floated as an island of life upon an endless world of death. Inside, time must have felt strange. The days were long, and the world beyond the walls could not be seen except through a narrow opening above. The animals stirred restlessly. The air was heavy. The labor of survival continued hour by hour. There was no comfort, no scenery, no certainty except the promise that had brought them there. But Noah trusted. He had obeyed when told to build, and now he trusted God to preserve what obedience had brought inside that ark. After the 40 days of rain, the waters did not immediately retreat. They remained upon the earth for 150 days, stretching in every direction like a silent and endless sea, where once there had been forests, valleys, gardens, roads, and homes. The world had been stripped down to water and memory. Then slowly the turning began. Jasher says that God sent a wind over the earth, not a violent wind of destruction, but a steady, purposeful breath that began to drive the waters back. The fountains of the deep were closed. The windows of heaven were shut. The same God who had unmade the world in judgment now began to reshape it in mercy. The flood receded not chaotically, but by command. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. After months of drifting, it settled at last, high and firm, no longer carried by the current. Yet even then, Noah did not rush ahead of God. He did not force the moment of emergence. He waited. In time, he opened the small window of the ark and sent out a raven. It went back and forth, finding no settled place in the desolation below. Then Noah released a dove. The dove flew out, circled over the waters, and returned, because there was still nowhere for her feet to rest. So Noah waited 7 more days. He sent the dove again, and this time she returned in the evening, carrying in her beak a freshly plucked olive leaf. That small leaf became a sign more powerful than any speech. It meant the waters were retreating. It meant life was returning. It meant judgment had not erased the possibility of renewal. Noah's heart must have trembled with the sight of it. Then he waited another 7 days and sent the dove once more. This time, she did not come back. She had found a place to dwell. The earth was opening again. At last, God spoke. Noah was to leave the ark with his wife, his sons, their wives, and every living creature with them. They were to come out into the cleansed world and multiply upon the earth once more. Noah opened the door, and for the first time in more than a year stepped onto dry ground. The world before him was not the world he had entered before the flood. It was emptied, washed, stripped, silenced. Everything familiar was gone. The old violence had been buried. The old cities had disappeared. The proud structures of human corruption had been erased beneath the hand of God. What lay before Noah was both loss and beginning, judgment and mercy standing together on the same ground. He had stepped out of death into a remade earth. And the first thing Noah did was not build a house, not survey the land, not count what remained. He worshipped. Because a man who has been carried through judgment by the mercy of God understands that survival itself is grace. There were no cities left, no cultivated fields, no roads, no walls, no visible trace of the civilization that had once spread across the face of the earth with all its noise, power, and pride. Everything that men had built, everything they had trusted, everything they had imagined would endure, had been swallowed and erased. What remained was silence. Mud stretched across the land. Rocks lay exposed where waters had torn the ground open. The earth itself seemed to be breathing again, slowly, quietly, beginning the long work of renewal. And yet the world, though emptied, was not without hope. The sky above Noah was clear. The air was clean in a way it had not been for generations. The ground, though barren and scarred, carried within it the promise of life waiting to rise again. Noah understood what stood before him. He had not merely survived a catastrophe. He had stepped into a beginning. So the first thing he did was build an altar. Before shelter, before settlement, before any thought of rebuilding life in practical terms, Noah turned to worship. He took from every clean animal and every clean bird and offered sacrifice to the Lord. The smoke rose upward into the heavens, the first act of worship in the cleansed world, the first public sign that humanity, though judged, had not been abandoned. Jasher tells us that the offering pleased God. And then the Lord came near to Noah and established a covenant, not a passing word, not a temporary kindness, but a promise meant to stand through all generations. He declared that never again would he curse the ground in the same way because of man, and never again would he destroy every living thing as he had done in the flood. As long as the earth remained, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would continue. The rhythms of creation would endure by his decree. Then God set a sign in the sky. A bow of many colors stretched across the heavens from horizon to horizon, a radiant arc hanging between heaven and earth, like a visible reminder of mercy. This, he said, would be the sign of the covenant. Whenever clouds gathered over the earth and the bow appeared, it would stand as a witness to his promise. Never again would the waters become a flood to destroy all flesh. Noah bowed with his face to the ground, overwhelmed not by his own strength or righteousness, but by the grace that had carried him through judgment. He knew he had not been preserved by skill, by wisdom, or by effort alone. He had been preserved because God had chosen to show mercy. And now, in a world washed clean yet still wounded by memory, Noah and his family were called to begin again. The Book of Jasher says that Noah lived 350 years after the flood. He watched his sons multiply, his grandchildren rise, and the earth slowly fill once more with people, flocks, dwellings, language, and human striving. He lived long enough to see the world begin to resemble the old one in shape, though not yet in scale. But he also saw something that must have grieved him deeply. The flood had cleansed the earth, but it had not removed sin from the human heart. Judgment had interrupted evil, but it had not erased the bent nature of man. Pride was still there. Greed was still there. Ambition, envy, rebellion, the restless desire for power and self-exaltation, all of it remained. The waters had washed away cities, but they had not washed away the old hunger inside fallen humanity. And Noah, who had witnessed both the patience and the wrath of God, saw with increasing clarity that it would not be long before men once again reached upward in defiance. Still, in those early years after the flood, there was peace. The earth was quiet. The sky stood open and clear above the remade world. The noise of old corruption had been silenced, at least for a time. Noah, the man who had passed through judgment and come out alive on the other side, gave thanks day after day for the mercy of the God who had saved him. The flood was over. The world had been washed clean. And from the family of Noah, all the nations of the earth would one day come forth. Chapter 4. Nimrod and the Tower. After the flood, the descendants of Noah spread gradually across the earth. At first, life moved with a kind of simplicity. Shem, Ham, and Japheth divided lands among their families, and each branch of the growing human family settled into its own region. They built homes, tended flocks, planted crops, raised children, and learned again how to live beneath the open sky of a world beginning anew. For a season, there was order. For a season, there was memory. The story of the flood remained fresh enough that men still spoke of it with trembling. They remembered the waters. They remembered the ark. They remembered that the world had once been judged and that only mercy had allowed the human race to begin again. But Jasher tells us that not all of Noah's descendants walked in Noah's fear of the Lord. And among those who turned away, one man rose, whose name would become a symbol of rebellion for generations to come. His name was Nimrod. Nimrod was the son of Cush and the grandson of Ham. He was born while the memory of the flood was still close enough to be spoken of not as distant legend, but as family history. Men around him still knew the names of those who had survived. They still told their children about the waters that had covered the mountains and the vessel that had floated upon the deep. But Nimrod did not fear the God of Noah. The memory of judgment did not humble him. Instead, it sharpened something dangerous within him. From his youth, he was marked by unusual strength, unusual cleverness, and a fierce, rising ambition. He was a hunter, but not only of animals. He knew how to hunt the loyalty of men. He knew how to speak in ways that stirred them, persuaded them, bound them to him. He understood power instinctively. He knew how to make people believe he was more than merely human. And according to the ancient tradition preserved in Jasher, Nimrod possessed something no other man of his age possessed: the garments of skin that God himself had made for Adam in the garden. The story of those garments is among the strangest and most haunting details in the old record. After Adam's death, they were preserved and passed down through generations, treated not as ordinary clothing, but as relics bound to the earliest days of mankind. They were said to carry a mysterious power no one fully understood, a kind of authority or sign that marked the wearer in a way both men and beasts could sense. They were connected somehow to that first covering God had given fallen humanity when shame entered the world. Whether through inheritance, seizure, cunning, or theft, those garments eventually came into Nimrod's hands, and when he wore them, something changed. The beasts of the field responded to him. Lions did not attack. Wolves did not flee. Wild creatures that should have resisted him became calm in his presence. The people saw this and were astonished. To them it seemed proof that Nimrod carried divine favor, that he had been marked by powers beyond ordinary men. And because men are always susceptible to visible signs of power, they exalted him. They made him their king. Jasher says that Nimrod was the first man after the flood to claim dominion over other men in a new and aggressive way. Before him there had been patriarchs, elders, and leaders of families. Authority had been rooted in age, wisdom, kinship, and memory. But Nimrod introduced something different. He did not rule by reverence. He ruled by force, spectacle, charisma, and the illusion of divine legitimacy. He gathered men around himself not because he reflected God's order, but because he embodied human ambition at its most intoxicating. He established his kingdom in the land of Shinar, in the broad valley between great rivers, where the soil was rich, the climate favorable, and the people numerous. There cities began to rise: Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, each one not merely a place of settlement, but a monument to organized human ambition. Under Nimrod, society did not just rebuild, it centralized, it concentrated, it gathered itself into strength. But ruling cities was not enough for him. Nimrod did not want influence alone. He wanted mastery. And deeper than that, he wanted to challenge heaven itself. He gathered the people and spoke with the kind of daring that pride mistakes for courage. Why, he asked, should they fear the God of Noah? Had not that God already promised never to send another flood? Was not the rainbow itself proof that heaven would not strike them down in the same way again? If so, why should humanity live scattered and restrained under divine command? Why should they spread across the earth as they had been told? Why not remain together? Why not consolidate strength, build a city unlike any before it, and raise a tower so high that no future judgment could threaten them? Why not secure themselves by their own greatness? The people listened, and his words found exactly the soil pride always loves. They said, "Yes, let us make a name for ourselves. Let us build something so vast and so enduring that no one will forget us. Let us establish our own greatness rather than live in humble dependence on God." Their motive was not faith. It was self-exaltation. It was not trust. It was defiance dressed as progress. It was the old rebellion of Eden rising again in a new form. The desire not merely to receive life from God, but to stand apart from him, above need, beyond submission, untouchable by judgment. So they began to build. The Book of Jasher describes the tower not as a crude pile of stones, but as a marvel of engineering, a staggering achievement of collective human will. They formed bricks from clay and baked them until they were hard as stone. They used bitumen, thick black tar drawn from the earth, as mortar, binding each layer with such strength that the structure seemed almost indestructible. The tower climbed upward month by month, year by year, rising over the plain like a visible declaration that mankind intended to establish its own immortality. It was architecture as rebellion. Every brick laid was a statement. Every height gained was a challenge. The people worked with relentless unity, driven by the dream of greatness, permanence, and self-made security. Nimrod stood over the project like a king of the new age, watching the structure rise and feeling in himself the swelling illusion of invincibility. But God was watching too. Jasher says that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the children of men were building. That language is striking, because what men regarded as monumental, God stooped to inspect. He saw not only the structure, not only the organization, not only the ingenuity. He saw the hearts behind it. He saw the pride that animated it, the rebellion hidden beneath its vision, the refusal to trust him, the determination to replace dependence with defiance. And he said, in effect, that because the people were one and spoke one language, this unity in rebellion would only deepen if left unchecked. So he resolved to scatter what pride had gathered. He would confuse their language so that they could no longer understand one another's speech. Then the judgment fell not as flood, not as fire, but as confusion. And it came suddenly. One morning the workers arrived, speaking as they always had, ready to continue the great project. But when they opened their mouths, what came out was no longer shared speech. A man asked for water, and his companion heard meaningless sounds. Another called for bricks, and the one beside him brought straw. Commands dissolved into chaos. Questions turned into incomprehensible noise. Frustration rose instantly. Arguments erupted. Shouting replaced cooperation. Men who had labored side by side now stared at one another like strangers. And because language is the thread that binds human action, once that thread was cut, the work itself began to collapse. Some tried to continue. They shouted louder, as though volume could overcome confusion. They pointed, gestured, strained to force meaning where shared words had vanished. But it was useless. Without understanding, there could be no coordination. Without coordination, there could be no tower. Families and clans who still shared the same tongue began instinctively to gather together. Small groups separated from the larger mass. Slowly, then more rapidly, they drifted away from the project and from one another, each people seeking a place where they could settle, build and live without the torment of endless misunderstanding. Thus the human race was scattered across the face of the earth, not because Nimrod's vision succeeded, but because God shattered the unity of their rebellion. The city was abandoned. The tower remained unfinished, a broken monument rising over the plain, not as proof of human greatness, but as a witness to human pride and its limits. And the place was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. Nimrod stood amid the ruins of his own ambition and watched the people who had once followed him disappear toward distant horizons. The empire he imagined would unite the world had dissolved under a single act of divine judgment. What he could gather by charisma, God could scatter with a word. What he could organize by power, God could unravel in a morning. And yet Nimrod's fall did not end the deeper story, because rebellion, once awakened in the human heart, rarely dies with one failed tower. It simply searches for another shape, another ruler, another generation willing to believe that man can rise without God and still endure. His power, built on fear, illusion, and carefully staged deception, collapsed in a single day. The tower was halted, the people were scattered, and the great vision of human glory that Nimrod had raised against heaven was broken apart before his eyes. But Nimrod did not repent. The Book of Jasher says that defeat did not humble him, it hardened him. He became more bitter, more defiant, more determined to drag those who remained with him deeper into rebellion. If he could not rise above God, then he would teach men to forget God altogether. He built temples to false gods. He taught the people to bow before the sun, the moon, the stars, and every created thing, anything at all, except the Creator himself. He told them that the God of Noah was not the only God, that heaven was full of powers, and that man, if bold enough, could ascend and become mighty like them. Under Nimrod, idolatry became more than error. It became a system, a culture, a counterfeit religion designed to keep men blind while making them feel wise. This was the dark and fractured world into which Abraham was born, a world scattered yet spiritually chained, confused yet proud, filled with carved idols and false worship, ruled by a tyrant who wore stolen garments and claimed authority from heaven. It was a world that had forgotten the God who had spared mankind through the flood, the God who had made covenant with Noah, the God who had hung a rainbow in the sky as an everlasting witness to his mercy. But even in that darkness, God was not finished. He was preparing to call one man, one faithful soul, out of the ruins of idolatry and into a journey that would alter the course of history forever. That man's name was Abram. And his story begins not with power, but with a question, a quiet question, spoken by a thoughtful child one evening beneath the stars. Father, who made the heavens and the earth? Chapter 5. Abraham's calling. In the city of Ur, in the land of the Chaldeans, there lived a man named Terah. He was a craftsman by trade, a maker of idols, skilled with his hands, and prosperous enough to earn his living by shaping gods out of wood and stone. His workshop was filled with statues of every size and kind, carved faces staring out in painted silence, figures polished and adorned, ready to be sold to men and women, desperate for blessings from something they could see and touch. Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And of the 3, Abram was the one who looked longest, thought deepest, and asked the kind of questions that make comfortable lies begin to crack. Even as a child, the Book of Jasher says, Abram sensed that something was profoundly wrong with the world around him. He watched his father carve a block of wood into the shape of a god, paint its eyes, smooth its hands, dress it, and place it for sale. He watched customers enter, bow their heads, burn incense, whisper prayers, and leave offerings before objects his father himself had made. And something in Abram refused to accept the madness of it. If these were gods, why did they need to be carried? If they were powerful, why did they depend on men to shape them? If they could hear, why did they never answer? If they could bless, why could they not even steady themselves when they toppled over? One day, while Abram was still young, terror left him in charge of the shop and went out to the marketplace. Abram stood alone among the idols, surrounded by rows of silent faces, polished wood, carved stone, and empty divinity. He looked at them for a long time. Then, in an act both fearless and devastating, he picked up a stick and began to smash them. One by one they fell beneath his hand. He shattered the smaller idols first, then the larger ones, until the room was full of splintered wood and broken stone. Only one he left standing, the largest of them all, and into its hand he placed the stick, as though it had struck the others down in a rage. When terror returned and saw the destruction, he was furious. He demanded to know what had happened, who had dared destroy his gods. Abram pointed to the largest statue and answered with calm, almost unbearable simplicity. That one did it. The others were quarreling over an offering, and he became angry and smashed them all. Terah stared at his son in disbelief. Then anger gave way to insult. Did Abram think him a fool? These were statues, he said, wood and stone. They could not move. They could not fight. They could not do anything. And Abram, without raising his voice, replied with the question that cut deeper than any hammer blow. Then why do you worship them? Terah had no answer. He could not refute his son's reasoning, but neither could he bear it. So he turned away, troubled and silent, as men often do when the truth has exposed something they do not want to surrender. But truth does not stay hidden once it has been spoken aloud. Word spread through the city that Terah's son had mocked the idols and shamed their worship. Some laughed, some were offended, some dismissed him as reckless, but one man was not amused at all. Nimrod, king over the region, heard that a young man in Ur was speaking openly against the gods, undermining the religion on which the loyalty of the people depended. And Nimrod understood something very well. If men ceased fearing the gods, they might also cease fearing the king who claimed to represent them. Doubt was dangerous. Truth was dangerous. And a young man with courage was more dangerous than either. So Nimrod sent for Abram and had him brought before the throne. The Book of Jasher describes the confrontation with all the tension of a battlefield. Though no sword had yet been drawn, Abram, still young, was taken into the palace and stood before a king surrounded by guards, wealth, and symbols of power. Nimrod sat on his throne wearing the garments of Adam, those ancient skins that had become a kind of sign and weapon in his hands, radiating the authority he had built through force and spectacle. He looked down on Abram and asked whether it was true that he denied the gods. Abram did not tremble. He did not soften his words. He met the king's gaze and answered that he did not deny the gods, because there were no gods to deny. There was only one true God, the creator of heaven and earth. He could not be carved from wood. He did not borrow power from men. He was the source of all power, and anyone who feared him need fear nothing else. Nimrod's face darkened at once. To him, this was not merely theological disagreement. It was open rebellion. He sneered at Abram's invisible God and defended the gods men could see, touch, and bow before. And then he did what tyrants always do when truth threatens their illusion. He ordered that Abram be thrown into the furnace. The soldiers seized him and dragged him through the city streets while crowds gathered to watch. Some pitied him, some mocked him, some waited in silence, sensing that something greater than a political punishment was taking place. Abram, however, remained strangely calm. His eyes were lifted upward, his lips moved in prayer. He was not carried to an ordinary fire, but to the great furnace where bricks were baked, where flames were fed with oil and timber until the heat itself became unbearable. No man could stand too near it without feeling his skin burn and his breath falter. It roared like judgment. It glowed like a mouth opening to devour. The soldiers bound Abram's hands and feet and raised him high over the furnace. Still he did not struggle. He prayed to the God of heaven and earth, asking for deliverance if it pleased him, but declaring that even if deliverance did not come, he would never bow to idols or worship the work of men's hands. Then they cast him into the fire. The crowd gasped and recoiled from the heat. The guards stepped backward, shielding their faces. Nimrod watched from a distance, expecting the flames to consume the young rebel in moments. But then the impossible happened. From the heart of the furnace, a different kind of light began to shine, not the red glare of burning wood, not the orange pulse of destruction, but a pure and radiant brightness, white and living, fierce and holy. And within that light figures appeared, tall and shining, clothed in garments brighter than the sun. Angels descended into the furnace and surrounded Abram. The flames bent away from him, as if an unseen wall had risen between him and death. The ropes that bound him burned away, but his flesh was untouched. The fire that should have consumed him became as harmless as warm wind. Abram stood in the center of the furnace at peace, unburned, unafraid, enclosed by the hosts of heaven. Silence fell over the crowd like a weight. Nimrod's face drained of color. For the first time in his life, the king who had manipulated faith and claimed to speak for the gods stood before a power he could neither explain nor control. Then Abram walked out. The flames seemed to part before him like a curtain opening. He stepped onto the earth with his clothes intact, his hair unsinged, not even carrying the smell of smoke. And everyone who saw it understood, whether they wanted to admit it or not, that the God Abram served was no carved image, no tribal invention, no fragile superstition. He was real. Nimrod knew he could not execute Abram now, not after the whole city had witnessed the miracle. So instead he banished him, warning him never again to speak the name of his God within the borders of the kingdom. But what Nimrod could not understand was that when a man has heard the voice of the living God and walked out of fire under his protection, the permission of kings no longer matters. That night, while Abram lay beneath the stars, still shaken by what had happened and still overwhelmed by the mercy that had preserved him, he heard a voice. It was not thunderous. It did not tear the heavens apart. It came gently, clearly, unmistakably. It spoke his name. Abram answered at once. Then the call came. Leave this place. Leave your country, your kindred, your father's house, and go to the land that God would show him. The promise followed close behind it, a great nation, blessing, a name made great not through pride like Babel, but through divine favor, and through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Abram did not demand a map. He did not ask for guarantees. He did not require proof beyond the voice itself. He answered with obedience. He would go. And so began the journey of the man who would become the father of faith. The man who walked away from everything familiar because he trusted the one who called him. He took with him his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, their servants, their possessions, and all they had gathered, and they set out toward Canaan. It was a long journey through wilderness and over mountains, past settlements and rivers, under nights where the stars seemed brighter than before. And all along the way, Abram sensed the presence of the Lord beside him, guiding, preserving, strengthening, speaking promises into the silence. When at last they entered the land of Canaan, Abram did not first claim it as possession. He first worshipped. He built an altar, knelt before the Lord, and gave thanks, not because every promise had already been fulfilled, but because the journey of obedience had begun. God had called, and he had answered. From that moment on, nothing in his life would ever be ordinary again. The Book of Jasher tells us that Abram lived in Canaan for many years. His wealth increased, his flocks multiplied, his servants grew in number. His household expanded, and he became known as a man of honor, restraint, and peace, a man even kings respected. But the one thing he desired most, the one thing bound up with the promise of God, did not come. Sarai remained barren. The years passed. Seasons changed. Flocks grew. Tents multiplied. Hair turned gray. But there was still no son. Abram prayed, waited, and believed. Yet the promise seemed to recede into the distance with every passing year. Still he held fast, because he had learned something in the furnace, in the wilderness, under the stars. When God speaks, delay is not denial. If the promise required a miracle, then so be it. The God who had brought him out of fire, led him out of Ur, and sustained him across lands he had never seen, was not limited by age, circumstance, or human impossibility. Then one night the Lord came to him again and told him to look up. Abram raised his eyes to the sky and saw the stars spread out above him, beyond counting, glittering across the vast black heavens. And God said that so would his offspring be. The Book of Jasher lingers over that moment because it was not the moment the promise was fulfilled. It was the moment Abram chose to believe before fulfillment existed in sight. He believed, and that faith was counted to him as righteousness. That is the mystery and power of true faith. It is not built on what can already be touched. It stands in darkness and trusts that light is still on its way. And for Abram, that light was drawing near. Chapter 6. Isaac and Jacob. The years continued to pass slowly for Abram and Sarai. They had land, wealth, honor, reputation, everything men usually call blessing, yet the deepest longing of their hearts remained unanswered. Sarah watched other women hold infants in their arms, heard the laughter of children near the tents, and felt the ache within her grow sharper with time. Her body was aging. The promise seemed more impossible with every season. At last, in weariness and sorrow, she came to Abram and told him that perhaps the Lord had withheld children from her. She urged him to take her servant Hagar as a wife, so that, through her, a family might be built. It was not the fulfillment Abram had hoped for, but he listened to Sarah, and Hagar conceived and bore a son. They named him Ishmael. For a time, Abram may well have thought the promise had taken this form after all. But God came to him again and made the matter unmistakably clear. Ishmael was not the child of the covenant. Sarah herself would bear a son, and through that son, the line of promise would continue. Abram fell on his face and laughed, not in unbelieving mockery, but in stunned amazement. He was 99 years old. Sarah was 90. By every ordinary measure, the promise had moved past impossible into absurd. But God asked the question that shatters every human limit. Is anything too hard for the Lord? He declared that at the appointed time he would return, and Sarah would have a son. Then he changed their names. Abram became Abraham, father of many nations. Sarai became Sarah, princess. It was as if God wrote the promise into their very identity, marking them with a future they had not yet seen. And exactly as he had spoken, 1 year later, Sarah conceived. When she felt the child moving within her, her tears were no longer tears of grief, but of astonished joy. When the boy was born, they named him Isaac Laughter, because joy had finally broken into the place where years of waiting had once lived. Isaac was the child of promise, the child born against all odds, the living declaration that when God speaks, time, age, nature, and human limitation cannot overturn his word. Abraham loved him with deep and tender devotion. He watched him grow, taught him to walk, told him the stories of the God who had called him from Ur, saved him from the furnace, and led him through the wilderness into the land of promise. Isaac listened with open heart and wondering eyes, learning to trust the same God his father trusted. But then came the command that tore through everything Abraham held most dear. God called to him and told him to take his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loved, and go to the land of Moriah, where he was to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain God would show him. Jasher does not dwell in dramatic description of Abraham's emotions, but the silence of that omission almost makes the moment more painful. It simply tells us that early the next morning Abraham rose, saddled his donkey, took 2 servants and Isaac, split the wood, and set out. That quiet obedience makes the scene almost unbearable. For 3 days they journeyed. Isaac carried the wood on his back. Abraham carried the knife and the fire. Few words passed between them. The servants followed behind, unaware that they were walking toward one of the greatest tests ever placed upon a human soul. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the mountain in the distance. He told the servants to remain behind with the donkey, while he and the boy went on to worship. And then, with astonishing faith, he said that they would return. Not I will return, we will return. Somehow, beyond logic and beyond comprehension, Abraham believed God would keep his promise. So, they climbed together. At last Isaac, sensing that something was missing, asked the question that must have pierced his father's heart more sharply than any blade. They had the fire and the wood, but where was the lamb for the offering? Abraham answered with steady lips over a breaking heart that God himself would provide the lamb. At the top of the mountain, he built the altar and laid the wood in order, every movement carrying the weight of obedience. Then he turned to Isaac, and Isaac understood. The Book of Jasher says that Isaac did not run, he did not fight. He was strong enough to resist, strong enough to escape if he had wanted to, but he did not. In that moment, the son of promise shared in the obedience of his father, and both of them stood inside a mystery of faith so deep that heaven itself was watching. Isaac was no longer a small child. He was a young man now, and Abraham was old. If he had wanted to resist, he could have. If he had wanted to flee down the mountain, he had the strength to do it. But he trusted his father, and beyond that, he trusted the God his father had served all his life. So he lay down upon the altar. Abraham bound his hands and feet with trembling hands of his own, every motion heavy with grief, every breath burdened with obedience. Then he lifted the knife. His eyes were blurred with tears. His arm rose high above the chest of the son he loved, the son of promise, the son through whom all the future had been spoken. And in that unbearable moment, just before the blade could fall, a voice thundered from heaven, sharp, clear, and unmistakable. "Abraham, Abraham." He gasped out his answer. "Here I am." Then came the command that turned agony into mercy. "Do not lay your hand on the boy. Do not harm him. For now it is known that Abraham feared God, since he had not withheld his son, his only son, from him." At once Abraham let the knife fall from his hand. He collapsed to his knees, overcome, sobbing with the force of release, tearing the ropes away, pulling Isaac into his arms and holding him as though he would never let him go again. Then, through the sound of his own weeping, he heard another sound behind him, a rustling in the thicket. He turned and saw a ram caught by its horns among the branches. God had provided exactly what was needed at exactly the moment it was needed. Abraham took the ram and offered it in Isaac's place, and he named that place, "The Lord Will Provide," because on that mountain he learned what every true servant of God must one day learn, that the Lord never tests without purpose, never asks in vain, and never fails to supply what his own will requires. He does not break his promises, he fulfills them, even through moments that seem impossible to bear. Isaac grew into manhood marked not by spectacle, but by quiet strength. He was not like Nimrod, building kingdoms of pride, nor like the men of old who sought greatness by force. Isaac was patient, he was steady, he was faithful in a quieter way, obedient without noise, strong without display. When the time came for him to marry, Abraham did not want his son joined to the idolatrous peoples around them, so he sent a trusted servant back to the land of his relatives to seek a wife from among his own people. The servant returned with Rebekah, a woman of grace, beauty, and clear divine favor upon her life. Isaac loved her deeply, and in that love there was peace. Yet even their marriage carried the familiar rhythm of waiting. Just as Sarah had waited long years in sorrow before the promise came, Rebekah too knew delay. But at last she conceived, and even before the children were born, the struggle had already begun. The Book of Jasher tells us that the children battled within her womb with such force that Rebekah was overcome by pain and confusion. It was as though two wills, two destinies, two futures were already wrestling in the darkness before birth. In distress, she cried out to the Lord, asking why such turmoil had come upon her. And the Lord answered with a prophecy that would shape nations. Two peoples were in her womb, two nations already divided within her body. One would be stronger than the other, and the older would serve the younger. When the day of birth arrived, the first child emerged red and covered in hair, and they named him Esau. But his brother came immediately after, his hand gripping Esau's heel as though even in birth he refused to remain behind. They named him Jacob, the heel grasper, the one who seizes, the one who contends. From the beginning, the brothers were unlike each other. Esau was a man of the open field, impulsive, rugged, ruled by appetite and action. Jacob was quieter, more inward, more observant, more content among tents and flocks than in wild places. Isaac loved Esau, perhaps because Esau's strength and hunting pleased him, and because he delighted in the game his son brought him. But Rebekah loved Jacob, and somewhere in her love lived the memory of God's word. The older would serve the younger. One day Esau came in from the field, worn thin by hunger, driven not by thought but by physical need. Jacob was cooking a pot of red stew, rich in smell, thick in color, immediate in its appeal. Esau could think of nothing except satisfying the craving that ruled him in that moment. He demanded some of the stew, and Jacob, seeing the opening, answered not with generosity but with calculation. He told Esau to sell his birthright first. That birthright was no small matter. It was inheritance, leadership, covenantal significance, the sacred place of the firstborn. But Esau, consumed by the moment, shrugged it off as though it were nothing. What use was a birthright, he said, if he died of hunger? He swore the oath, took the meal, ate, drank, and walked away satisfied for an hour, but diminished for a lifetime. Jasher makes the tragedy plain. Esau did not lose the birthright because someone stole what he treasured. He lost it because he despised what he should have treasured and traded it for something as temporary as a bowl of food. Appetite conquered destiny because he treated the holy as disposable. Years passed. Isaac grew old. His eyes dimmed until he could no longer see clearly, and sensing that death might not be far off, he called Esau to him. He told his son to go out into the field, hunt game, prepare the meal he loved, and return so that the blessing of the firstborn might be spoken over him before he died. Esau went out at once. But Rebekah overheard the exchange, and she did not forget what God had said long before those sons were born. She summoned Jacob and told him what was happening. The blessing, she believed, belonged to him, not to Esau. And so she devised a plan. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothing so that his scent would be familiar. She covered his smooth arms and neck with goat skins so that he would feel like his hairy brother when Isaac reached out to touch him. She prepared the food Isaac loved and sent Jacob into the tent, carrying the deception in his hands and the promise in his future. Jacob entered with his heart pounding. Isaac, blind and uncertain, asked who stood before him. Jacob answered with a lie, calling himself Esau, claiming to have done what his father requested. Isaac hesitated. The speed of his return troubled him. How had the hunt gone so quickly? Jacob answered again, drawing even God into the deception, saying that the Lord had granted him success. Isaac asked him to come near. He touched the skins on Jacob's arms and was troubled by the contradiction before him. The voice sounded like Jacob, but the hands felt like Esau. Still uncertain, he asked once more whether this was truly Esau. Jacob persisted in the lie. So Isaac ate, and then, laying his hands upon Jacob's head, he spoke the blessing, a blessing of heaven's dew, earth's richness, grain and wine in abundance, dominion over peoples, and authority over brothers, a covenant-shaped word that could not be withdrawn once spoken. The blessing descended, and with it the future shifted irrevocably. Not long after, Esau returned from the field with the game he had hunted, ready to receive what he believed was his by right. When Isaac realized what had happened, he trembled violently. When Esau learned that Jacob had come deceitfully and taken the blessing, his cry rose up loud and bitter, the cry of a man who suddenly understands that something sacred has slipped away beyond retrieval. He begged for another blessing, pleaded for some word that might restore what had been lost. But Isaac could not reverse what had been spoken. Jacob had received the blessing, and Esau, though he wept, could not call back the moment in which he had already shown contempt for his birthright. From that day, hatred burned in Esau like fire. He resolved in his heart that when Isaac was dead, Jacob would die too. Rebekah learned of the threat, and the same mother who had secured the blessing for Jacob now moved to save his life. She told him to flee to her brother Laban in Haran and remain there until Esau's anger cooled. So Jacob left home alone, afraid, carrying little more than a staff and the weight of both blessing and guilt. He walked out into the wilderness with no certainty except distance. The first night he lay down with a stone beneath his head, a fugitive under the open sky. And there, in sleep, heaven opened to him. He saw a ladder, or stairway, rising from earth to heaven, and on it angels ascended and descended in ceaseless motion between the realms. Above it stood the Lord himself, and God spoke, declaring that he was the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, and that the land on which Jacob lay would one day belong to him and to his offspring. His descendants would be like the dust of the earth, spread abroad in every direction, and through him and through his line all the families of the earth would be blessed. Then came the promise that would sustain him through every coming hardship. God would be with him, keep him wherever he went, and bring him back to that land. He would not be abandoned until every word God had spoken had been fulfilled. Jacob awoke, trembling, overwhelmed by the realization that the place where he had lain down in fear was filled with the presence of God. Surely the Lord was in that place, he said, and he had not known it. He took the stone that had served as his pillow, set it upright as a pillar, poured oil over it, and named the place Bethel, the house of God. For the first time, Jacob encountered the Lord not merely through the stories of Abraham and Isaac, not merely through inherited faith, but in a direct and personal way that would mark the rest of his life. There he made a vow that if God would truly be with him and keep him in the way he was going, then the Lord would be his God. The journey had only begun. The man who walked away from home, as Jacob the heel grasper, the deceiver, the fearful fugitive, would one day return changed, bearing a new name, Israel, the one who wrestles with God. Chapter 7. Joseph in Egypt. Jacob reached Haran and remained there for 20 years under the roof and within the schemes of his uncle Laban. There he learned painfully what it means for deception to return upon the deceiver. He loved Rachel with all his heart, but was given Leah first. And so the man who had once disguised himself before a blind father now found himself wounded by trickery in another household. In time he married both sisters, Leah, whom he had not chosen, and Rachel, whom he loved deeply. From these two women, and from their servants, came 12 sons and 1 daughter. Those sons would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Yet among them all, one son rose above the rest in Jacob's heart. His name was Joseph. Joseph was the 11th son, but he was the firstborn of Rachel, the wife Jacob had loved most. Because of that, Jacob's affection settled upon him in a way the others could see and feel. He made Joseph a coat of many colors, a beautiful garment that was more than clothing. It was a declaration. It marked him out. It told the household, whether intentionally or not, that this son held a place the others did not. The brothers saw it, and resentment began to grow. Jasher tells us that their hatred did not arrive fully formed. It started small, then gathered force day by day. Joseph was different from them. He was gentler, where they were harsh. He was truthful where they were calculating. He lived with a kind of moral clarity that exposed them simply by existing. Worse still, when they acted wrongly, Joseph told their father, to men who already felt overlooked, this made him unbearable. Then Joseph began to dream. One night he dreamed that he and his brothers were in the field binding sheaves of grain, and suddenly his sheaf rose and stood upright, while the sheaves of his brothers gathered around it and bowed down. He told them what he had seen, and instead of wonder, they answered with anger. Did he think he would one day rule over them? Did he imagine they would bow before him? The dream did not soften them. It sharpened their hatred. Then he dreamed again. This time the dream was even greater, even more impossible to ignore. Joseph saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down before him. When he told it to his father and brothers, even Jacob reacted sharply, asking what kind of dream this could be. Would he, his mother, and his brothers truly bow themselves to the ground before Joseph? The question sounded like rebuke, and on the surface it was. Yet Jacob did not dismiss the dream entirely. He stored the words away in the quiet chambers of his heart, turning them over in silence, sensing perhaps that there was more in them than youthful pride. The brothers, however, did not ponder. They nursed hatred. What had begun as resentment over favoritism now deepened into something darker, something dangerous. Every dream Joseph spoke seemed to them another insult, another wound, another sign that this younger brother believed himself raised above them all. Then came the day when Jacob sent Joseph out to find his brothers, who were far from home tending the flocks. As they looked up and saw him approaching in the distance, the coat of many colors visible even from afar, hatred rose in them all at once. One brother called out that the dreamer was coming, and in those words there was already murder. They spoke of killing him, of throwing him into a pit, of inventing a story about a wild animal devouring him, and then watching to see what would become of his dreams. But Reuben, the eldest, intervened. He urged them not to shed blood. Instead, he suggested they cast Joseph alive into an empty cistern in the wilderness, intending in secret to return later and rescue him. So when Joseph arrived, still unsuspecting, still carrying his father's concern, they fell upon him, stripped him of the coat that marked him out, and hurled him into the pit. Then, in one of the cruelest details in all of the story, they sat down to eat. The Book of Jasher lingers there because the moment deserves to be felt. Joseph was below them in darkness, crying out from the cistern, pleading with his brothers, begging them to let him out, asking how flesh and blood could do this to one of their own. But they ignored him. They hardened themselves against his voice. They mocked the dreams that had stirred their jealousy and ate their meal as though nothing sacred had just been broken. While they sat there, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by on its way to Egypt. Then Judah spoke, and greed joined what hatred had begun. What profit, he asked, was there in killing their brother? Better to sell him than spill his blood. After all, he said, he was their own brother, their own flesh. The words were twisted with irony because they used kinship not as a reason for mercy, but as a reason to choose a more profitable cruelty. The others agreed. They lifted Joseph out of the pit, not to spare him, but to sell him. For 20 pieces of silver they handed him over. The merchants bound his hands and led him away, and Joseph looked back through tears at the brothers who should have protected him, unable to understand how hatred had turned family into betrayal. To complete the lie, the brothers took Joseph's coat, dipped it in the blood of a goat, and carried it back to their father. They presented it with calculated restraint, asking only whether it might be his son's garment. Jacob recognized it at once. In a single instant, hope collapsed into grief. He tore his clothes, clothed himself in sackcloth, and mourned as a man whose heart had been ripped open. He concluded that a wild beast had devoured Joseph, and that his beloved son had surely been torn to pieces. No one could comfort him. The sorrow was too deep, too personal, too violent. He declared that he would go down to the grave mourning for his son. But Joseph was not dead. He was alive, chained, terrified, and carried toward Egypt. And though he did not yet know it, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not abandoned him for a single moment. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, a man of wealth, rank, and influence. From the beginning, Potiphar noticed something unusual about the Hebrew slave brought into his house. The Book of Jasher says that everything Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Crops flourished. Livestock multiplied in health and strength. Order settled over the household. Affairs ran smoothly under his hand. It was as if the blessing of God rested visibly upon him, even in a foreign land, even in chains, even in a place that should have buried his future. Potiphar saw it and trusted him more and more, until eventually Joseph was placed over the whole household, entrusted with everything his master possessed. Yet favor in one area does not prevent testing in another. And soon Joseph's next trial emerged, not from hardship, but from temptation. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph too, but what she saw was not his faithfulness, only his youth, his appearance, and the desire he stirred in her. Day after day she sought to seduce him. She spoke softly. She made herself available. She pressed her intentions without shame. But Joseph refused her every time. He answered not merely out of loyalty to his master. though that was real, but out of reverence for God. His master, he said, had withheld nothing from him except her, because she was Potiphar's wife. How then could he do such a wicked thing and sin against God? That is the heart of Joseph's integrity. He did not measure sin only by whether he could hide it or survive it. He measured it by what it meant before the face of God. But refusal humiliated her, and humiliation turned quickly to malice. One day, when no one else was in the house, she caught hold of Joseph's cloak and demanded that he lie with her. Joseph tore himself free and fled, leaving the cloak behind in her hands. Rather than repent of her shame, she weaponized it. She cried out, summoned the servants, held up the garment, and accused Joseph of coming in to mock and violate her. When Potiphar heard the story, rage overcame whatever trust he had once placed in Joseph, and the young Hebrew was thrown into prison, the king's prison, where those who had offended power waited in darkness. There, at last, it might have seemed that Joseph's dreams had truly died. Betrayed by brothers, sold as a slave, falsely accused, and now buried in prison, he had every earthly reason to believe his life had been broken beyond repair. Yet the Book of Jasher reminds us that even in prison the Lord was with him. The same pattern repeated itself. Joseph's character could not stay hidden. The keeper of the prison recognized his trustworthiness and placed the other prisoners under his care. Once more, even in confinement, everything Joseph did prospered. 2 years passed in that place, long enough for hope to grow thin. Then one night 2 of Pharaoh's officers, his cupbearer and his baker, were imprisoned there, and on the same night both men dreamed disturbing dreams. Joseph saw their troubled faces in the morning and asked why they looked so downcast. They told him they had dreamed, but there was no one to interpret what they had seen. Joseph answered with the humility that marked him all through his life. Interpretations belong to God. Then he asked them to tell him their dreams. The cupbearer spoke first. He had seen a vine with 3 branches bud, blossom, and produce ripe grapes. In the dream he took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interpreted immediately. The 3 branches were 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh would lift up the cupbearer's head and restore him to his office. Then Joseph made a simple request. When it went well with him, he was to remember Joseph and speak of him to Pharaoh, so that he might be brought out of that unjust prison. Encouraged by the favorable interpretation, the baker then told his dream. He had seen 3 baskets of bread on his head, and birds were eating from the top basket. This time Joseph's face grew grave. Again the 3 baskets were 3 days, but this man's future would not be restoration. Pharaoh would lift up his head as well, but only to execute him, and the birds would consume his flesh. 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, both interpretations came to pass exactly as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored, the baker was hanged, and the cupbearer forgot Joseph. 2 more years passed. Then Pharaoh himself was shaken by dreams no one in Egypt could explain. He saw 7 fat cows rise from the Nile, followed by 7 gaunt and ugly cows that devoured the healthy ones without becoming full. Then he dreamed of 7 plump heads of grain swallowed by 7 thin, scorched heads. Disturbed and unable to understand, Pharaoh summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, but none could tell him what the dreams meant. Only then did the cupbearer remember the Hebrew in prison. He told Pharaoh about the young man who had interpreted dreams accurately. Joseph was summoned at once. They hurried him out of the prison, shaved him, clothed him properly, and brought him before the throne. Pharaoh told Joseph that he had heard Joseph could interpret dreams. Joseph answered with the same humility he had shown before. The power was not in him. God would give Pharaoh the answer of peace. Pharaoh recounted the dreams, and Joseph, without hesitation, revealed their meaning. The 2 dreams were one message. 7 years of great abundance were coming upon Egypt, years of plenty so rich that the land would overflow. But after them would come 7 years of famine so severe that the memory of abundance would be swallowed by lack. God had shown Pharaoh what he was about to do, and the repetition of the dream meant the matter was fixed. Joseph then went further. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man over the land to collect and store grain during the years of plenty, so that Egypt might survive the famine to come. Pharaoh looked at Joseph and recognized more than intelligence. He recognized the Spirit of God upon him. He asked whether anyone could be found like this man, so discerning and wise. Then, in one of the most astonishing reversals in Scripture, Pharaoh raised Joseph from prisoner to ruler in a single day. Because God had made all this known to him, Pharaoh declared, "No one in the kingdom was as wise as Joseph." He placed him over his own house and over all the people of Egypt. Only in the matter of the throne would Pharaoh remain greater. So Joseph, the rejected brother, the sold slave, the falsely accused prisoner, the forgotten dreamer, became second only to Pharaoh in all Egypt. That is how God works in these stories. He does not always spare his servants the pit, the chain, the prison, or the false accusation, but none of those things can cancel what he has appointed. The 7 years of abundance came exactly as Joseph had foretold. Grain poured in from every harvest, and Joseph stored it city by city in such quantities that it could no longer be measured. Then the famine came, just as surely as the abundance had. It spread beyond Egypt into the surrounding lands, tightening like a hand around every nation. People cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh sent them all to Joseph, telling them to do whatever he commanded. Far away in Canaan, Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, so he sent 10 of his sons to buy food. Benjamin, the youngest and Rachel's only other son, he kept behind, because the wound of Joseph's loss still bled within him, and he could not bear the thought of losing Benjamin too. When Joseph's brothers came into Egypt and bowed before the governor to ask for grain, they did not recognize him. Years had changed him. Power had clothed him differently. Egypt had reshaped the outward man, but Joseph recognized them at once. Jasher says that when he saw them, memory surged back through him, the pit, the cries, the chains, the silver, the long road into slavery. Yet he did not reveal himself. Not yet. He spoke harshly, accused them of being spies, and cast them into prison for 3 days. After that he released them all except Simeon, whom he held as a hostage, telling them they must return with their youngest brother if they wished to see his face again and prove that they were truthful men. Terrified, the brothers returned to Canaan and told Jacob what had happened. Jacob cried out in anguish. Joseph was gone, Simeon was gone, and now Benjamin too was being demanded from him. To his grief-stricken mind, everything seemed to be against him. But the famine did not yield to sorrow. Hunger continued until there was no choice left. At last, with a broken heart, Jacob allowed Benjamin to go. When Joseph saw Benjamin, his own full brother, the only other son of Rachel, emotion nearly overwhelmed him. Still, he restrained himself and prepared a feast, seating the brothers in birth order in a way that astonished them, and giving Benjamin 5 times as much as the others. Then came one final test. Joseph ordered his steward to fill their sacks with grain and secretly place his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. After they had departed, soldiers pursued them and accused them of theft. The brothers protested their innocence, confident that no such thing could be found among them. But when the cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack, they tore their clothes in grief and returned to the city. Joseph declared that the man in whose sack the cup was found would remain as his slave while the others could return home. And there the test reached its deepest point. Years earlier, these same brothers had abandoned one favored son without mercy. Now another beloved son stood in danger. Would they leave him too? But Judah stepped forward and delivered one of the most moving pleas in all of Scripture. He recounted their father's grief, the loss of one son, the bond between Jacob and Benjamin, and the certainty that if they returned without him, their father would die under the weight of sorrow. Then Judah offered himself in Benjamin's place. He asked to remain as a slave so the boy could go free. In that moment, Joseph saw what he needed to see. The brothers who had once sold him had been changed by grief, guilt, and time. They were no longer willing to sacrifice another brother for their own survival. Joseph could not restrain himself any longer. He sent all the Egyptian attendants from the room, and then he wept so loudly that the sound carried through the palace. At last he spoke the words that shattered the fear and silence around them. He was Joseph. He asked whether his father was still alive. The brothers stood frozen, unable to answer, struck dumb by terror and astonishment. Joseph drew them near and repeated the truth. He was their brother, the one they had sold into Egypt. Yet instead of vengeance, he spoke mercy. They were not to be grieved or angry with themselves in the sense of despair, because God had sent him ahead of them to preserve life. Human sin had been real, their betrayal had been evil, but God had overruled their evil for a greater purpose. Joseph embraced Benjamin and wept. He kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Then he told them to hurry back to Jacob and declare that God had made him lord over all Egypt, and that their father must come down without delay. At first Jacob could not believe the news. The heart that had carried grief for years was slow to receive sudden joy. But when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent and realized the report was true, his spirit revived. Joseph was alive. The son he had mourned as dead had not only lived, but had become the instrument through whom God had preserved them all. So Jacob set out for Egypt with his whole household, 70 persons in all. They settled in the land of Goshen, the richest part of the country, where they lived under Joseph's protection and God's blessing. There, the family of promise grew in peace for a season, waiting for the next movement of the story God had begun with Abraham. Joseph lived long enough to see his children's children, and before he died, he gathered his brothers and reminded them that though he was about to die, God would surely visit them and bring them up out of that land, to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He made them swear an oath that when God brought them out, they would carry his bones with them. Joseph died at 110 years of age, but his final words did not die with him. They passed into the memory of Israel as a promise within the promise, a seed of hope planted deep against the darkness of future slavery. God had not forgotten his people. Deliverance would come. Chapter 8. Moses and the Exodus. After Joseph died, the Israelites continued to live in Egypt, and they multiplied greatly. Their families expanded, their tents filled the land of Goshen, and what had begun as a household of 70 slowly became a people. For a time they prospered under the memory of Joseph's favor, but generations passed and memory faded. A new king arose in Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. And the Book of Jasher says that this Pharaoh looked out at the Israelites and saw not neighbors, not beneficiaries of Egypt's shelter, but a threat. They were many, strong, set apart, and unmistakably different. They worshipped a god Egypt neither understood nor honored, and Pharaoh looked at their growing numbers with suspicion. In his mind, they were no longer guests living under the shadow of Joseph's old favor. They were a danger waiting to rise. He feared that if war ever came, they might join Egypt's enemies and turn the strength of their multiplication against the throne. So he resolved to crush them before they could become impossible to control. A decree went out, and the descendants of Abraham were reduced to slaves. They were driven into forced labor, compelled to build store cities for Pharaoh, monuments of brick and stone meant to glorify the kingdom that oppressed them. From dawn until dusk they bent beneath the sun, carrying loads, shaping mortar, laying brick, and when exhaustion slowed their hands, the overseers answered with whips. Their backs were scarred, their bodies weakened. Their groaning rose into the air. They cried out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but for a time heaven seemed silent, and silence is one of the hardest burdens faith ever bears. Yet their suffering only deepened Egypt's cruelty. Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill every male child born to the Israelites. But the midwives feared God more than they feared the king. They refused to become servants of slaughter. They let the boys live. When Pharaoh discovered that his command had been defied, he gave another order, darker and more savage than the first. Every Hebrew son was to be cast into the Nile. The river that fed Egypt was turned into an instrument of terror. It was into that world, into blood, fear, and grief that Moses was born. His mother Jochebed looked upon her son and saw more than an infant. She saw beauty, strength, life, and the unbearable reality that the king had marked him for death. She could not surrender him. So for 3 months she hid him, keeping him close, soothing every cry. living in constant dread that an Egyptian soldier might hear his voice and end his life in a moment. But no child can be hidden forever. At last, when concealment became impossible, she did something only faith and desperation together could teach a mother to do. She made a basket of reeds, sealed it with pitch and tar, laid the child inside, and placed it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. Then she told Miriam, his sister, to watch from a distance. The basket drifted gently upon the water, carried by the current, and what looked to human eyes like chance was in truth the hand of providence. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent for it. When she opened it and found the child crying inside, compassion rose in her heart. She recognized at once that he was one of the Hebrew children, one of those her father had condemned, yet she did not cast him back into the water. She lifted him up, she held him close. In that moment, mercy triumphed over decree. Then Miriam stepped forward with wisdom beyond her years and asked whether a Hebrew woman should be found to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and so the mother who had surrendered her baby to the river received him back into her own arms under royal protection. The child meant to die now lived in the house of Egypt's power, yet was nourished by his own mother, who no doubt whispered into his ears the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the stories of promise, covenant, and the God of their fathers. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, drawn out, because she had drawn him out of the water. The name itself carried prophecy. He who was drawn out would one day draw a nation out with him. The Book of Jasher tells us that Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. He learned language, law, strategy, governance, and the discipline of rulers. He was trained as a prince, sharpened in mind, strong in body, eloquent in thought, and respected by those around him. Yet beneath all the learning and privilege, he knew he was not Egyptian. There remained in him a deeper belonging, a buried identity that the palace could not erase. So when he was 40 years old, he went out to look upon his own people and the burden they bore. There he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew slave mercilessly, beating him without pity, and something inside Moses ignited. He looked around. No one seemed to be watching. In a moment of righteous fury mixed with human impulsiveness, he struck the Egyptian and killed him, then buried the body in the sand. But hidden deeds do not remain hidden forever. The next day, when Moses saw two Hebrews fighting and tried to rebuke the one in the wrong, the man answered him with contempt. Who had made Moses ruler and judge over them? Was he planning to kill him the way he had killed the Egyptian? In that instant, Moses knew the secret had escaped into the open. And when Pharaoh learned of it, the sentence was already clear. Moses would die if he stayed. So he fled. He left behind palace, privilege, rank, and every visible sign of security, crossing into the wilderness toward the land of Midian. There, stripped of status and exhausted by fear, he sat down beside a well, and there, even in exile, the shape of his calling began to appear. 7 daughters of a priest named Jethro came to draw water for their father's flock, but rough shepherds drove them away. Moses rose to defend them. He drew water for their sheep and saw them safely on their way. When the daughters returned and told their father what had happened, Jethro wondered why they had left such a man outside. Moses was invited in. He remained. He married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and began a new life as a shepherd in the wilderness. For 40 years he lived in obscurity, far from Egypt, far from the cries of his people, far from the palace where he once walked. To human eyes he must have looked forgotten, but God does not forget the man he is preparing. Then came the day that changed everything. Moses was tending the flock near Horeb, the mountain of God, when he saw something that stopped him in his tracks, a bush burning with fire yet not consumed by it. Flame covered it, but the branches remained whole, fire without destruction, holiness without ash. Moses turned aside to see the wonder, and from the midst of the fire, a voice called his name. He answered, and the voice warned him not to come nearer. He was to remove his sandals, because the ground where he stood was holy. Moses obeyed, trembling. Then the voice identified itself as the God of his father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At that Moses hid his face, afraid to look upon God. And the Lord spoke words that must have pierced Moses to the heart. He had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cry. He knew their suffering. He had come down to deliver them, to bring them out of slavery and into a broad and good land flowing with milk and honey. Then the command came. Moses was to go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. But Moses, after 40 years in the wilderness, no longer resembled the prince who once struck down an Egyptian. He answered not with confidence, but with trembling inadequacy. Who was he asked, to stand before Pharaoh? Who was he to lead Israel out? God did not answer by praising Moses. He answered by promising his own presence. I will be with you. Yet Moses still hesitated. What if the people did not believe him? What if they said the Lord had not appeared to him? Then God gave him signs. The staff in his hand became a serpent when thrown down, then became a staff again when seized by the tail. It was a sign that the God who sends him rules over what men fear. Still Moses resisted. He confessed that he was slow of speech and tongue. The Lord answered with holy impatience. Who had made man's mouth? Who made him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Was it not the Lord himself? Moses was told to go, and that God would be with his mouth and teach him what to say. But even then Moses pleaded that someone else be sent. At last the anger of the Lord was stirred, and Aaron, Moses' brother, was appointed to speak with him and for him. The work would still be Moses's, but the Lord would sustain them both. So Moses returned to Egypt, the land he had fled 40 years earlier. Aaron met him at the mountain of God, and together they went to the elders of Israel, spoke the words the Lord had given, and performed the signs. The people believed. Their heads bowed in worship because the God who had seemed silent had not in fact forgotten them. Then Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh and delivered the command of the Lord, the God of Israel. Let his people go, that they might hold a feast to him in the wilderness. Pharaoh answered with laughter and scorn. Who was this Lord, he asked, that he should obey his voice? He did not know the Lord, and he would not let Israel go. With that answer, the conflict was set. It was no longer merely Moses against Pharaoh, nor slaves against taskmasters. It was the living God against the false gods of Egypt, the Creator confronting an empire built on rebellion. The Book of Jasher describes the plagues not as random disasters, but as deliberate acts of divine warfare, each one striking at the heart of Egyptian pride and exposing the weakness of every idol. First, the Nile turned to blood, not merely red in color, but thick, foul, corrupt, and undrinkable. Fish died in the river by the thousands and floated upward in decay. The stench rose beneath the sun. Egyptians dug around the river looking for water, but found only more blood. For 7 days the land thirsted, and still Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Then frogs came, overflowing the boundaries of nature and invading every space human beings consider private. They entered houses, bedrooms, ovens, kneading bowls. The land croaked with infestation. Egypt could not escape them. Pharaoh called for Moses and promised release if the frogs were taken away. Moses prayed. The frogs died. Relief came. And the moment relief came, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Then came gnats, clouds of tiny torment, filling air and skin and breath. After that came swarms of flies, thick and oppressive, invading homes, food, and all ordinary life until existence itself became unbearable. Yet Pharaoh would not yield. Then Egypt's livestock fell, horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks, while the animals of Israel remained untouched. Even Pharaoh's magicians admitted what was happening. This, they said, was the finger of God. But Pharaoh did not listen. Then boils broke out on the skin of Egypt, painful sores rising from the greatest to the least, until even the magicians could not stand before Moses. Still the king refused. Then hail fell. Great crashing stones of ice mingled with fire, tearing down trees, destroying crops, killing animals and men caught outside. Yet in Goshen, where Israel dwelled, there was no hail. Pharaoh called Moses and admitted sin with his lips, confessing that the Lord was righteous and he and his people were wicked. He begged for the storm to cease and promised release. Moses prayed. The hail ended, and Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Then locusts came, so many that the land darkened beneath them. They devoured every living green thing the hail had left behind. Egypt was stripped bare. Still Pharaoh refused. Then darkness fell, not the ordinary darkness of sunset, but a heavy, oppressive darkness that could be felt, a darkness that swallowed movement, suffocated vision, and imprisoned men where they stood. For 3 days the Egyptians could not see one another or rise from their places. Yet in the dwellings of Israel there was light. At last Pharaoh summoned Moses and offered a compromise. The people might go, even with their children, but the flocks and herds were to remain behind. Moses refused completely. Not a hoof would be left, because the people did not yet know with what they must worship the Lord until they came to the place he had appointed. Rage twisted Pharaoh's face. He drove Moses away and warned that the day Moses saw his face again would be the day he died. Moses answered that Pharaoh had spoken truly. He would not see his face again. Then the Lord announced one final plague, the last and most terrible. After this, Pharaoh would not merely allow Israel to go, he would drive them out. At midnight the Lord himself would pass through the land of Egypt, and every firstborn would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the captive in the prison and the firstborn among the beasts. But Israel was given instructions of life in the midst of judgment. Every household was to take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it at twilight, and mark the doorposts and lintel with its blood. That blood would stand between death and those inside. When the Lord saw the blood, he would pass over that house. Jasher says the cry that rose from Egypt that night was unlike any sound heard before or since. It was a wailing of grief that filled streets, palaces, prisons, and cottages alike. There was not a house in all Egypt without someone dead. Pharaoh rose in the night. His servants rose. The whole nation shook beneath sorrow. And in the darkness, broken at last, Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. "Rise up," Pharaoh said. "Leave. Go out from among my people, you and the children of Israel. Go and serve the Lord as you have demanded. Take your flocks, take your herds, take everything, and be gone." And so they went. 600,000 men, not counting women and children, moving out with their flocks, their herds, their kneading bowls, their memories, their grief, and their hope. They marched out of Egypt in open daylight, no longer bent beneath the lash, no longer hidden in the shadows of brick pits and slave camps, but walking as a people delivered by the hand of God. The chains were behind them. The long night of bondage had been broken. What generations had prayed for through tears and silence had finally come. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had risen to act, and Egypt, for all its power, had been unable to stand against him. But Pharaoh's surrender was as unstable as his pride. Once the first shock of loss began to settle and the reality of what had happened sank in, his heart twisted back toward rebellion. He realized he had released the labor force on which so much of Egypt depended, and the old fury returned. He gathered his army, 600 chosen chariots, along with the rest of Egypt's horses, horsemen, and soldiers, and he pursued them. What had been a procession of freedom suddenly became a race against destruction. Israel came to the edge of the Red Sea, and there the terror closed in around them. Before them stretched the sea, wide and deep, impossible to cross by ordinary means. Behind them rose the sound of Egypt coming fast, the thunder of hooves, the clatter of wheels, the cry of men determined to drag them back into slavery or slaughter them where they stood. Fear overtook the people. They cried out in panic, accusing Moses of bringing them into the wilderness to die. Freedom had lasted only long enough for danger to expose how fragile their faith still was. But Moses stood before the people and answered not with panic, but with the steadiness of a man who had learned to trust the voice in the burning bush. He told them not to be afraid, to stand firm, and to watch the salvation the Lord would bring them that day. The Egyptians they saw, he said, they would never see again. The Lord himself would fight for them. They needed only to be still. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and commanded movement. Why cry out now? The people were to go forward. Moses was to lift his staff, stretch out his hand over the sea, and divide it so that Israel could pass through on dry ground. Moses obeyed, and the waters responded. The sea split open. On the right and on the left, walls of water rose and stood, held fast as though invisible hands had gripped the deep and forced it to make way for the people of God. Between those walls the ground lay dry, not muddy, not half-flooded, but dry. And Israel walked through, man, woman, child, old, young, with flocks and herds, and all they carried, surrounded by the roar of waters, yet touched by not a single drop. The Egyptians charged in after them, but the path that served as deliverance for one people became judgment for another. The Lord threw Pharaoh's army into confusion. Chariot wheels turned against them, horses stumbled, order disintegrated. Panic spread among the soldiers as they realized too late that they were not pursuing helpless fugitives, but pressing into the place where the Lord himself was fighting against them. And when the last Israelite stepped safely onto the far shore, Moses stretched out his hand once more. The waters fell, the walls collapsed. The sea returned to its strength, and Pharaoh's chariots, horsemen, and soldiers were swallowed whole beneath the flood. Not one of them remained. On the shore, the Israelites looked back and saw the bodies of the Egyptians washing up upon the sand. Then at last, holy fear fell upon them. They believed in the Lord and in Moses, his servant. And Moses lifted his voice in song. He sang to the Lord because he had triumphed gloriously, because the horse and its rider had been thrown into the sea, because what no human strength could have accomplished, God had done with a word and an outstretched hand. The exodus was complete. The promise was moving forward. The people who had once lived under death now stood on the other side of the sea with the wilderness before them and the land of promise still ahead. Chapter 9. The Wilderness Years. Yet freedom did not immediately become ease. Joy did not eliminate testing. Only 3 days after crossing the sea, the people found themselves without water. The desert stretched around them under blazing heat. Their throats dried, their lips cracked. The exhilaration of deliverance gave way quickly to physical desperation. At last they came to a place called Marah, where there was water, but when they tasted it, they spat it out in disgust. It was bitter, undrinkable. At once the people turned against Moses with complaint. What were they supposed to drink? Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses cast it into the water, and the bitterness gave way. The water became sweet. It was the first test after the sea, and it revealed something sobering. A people can witness miracles and still falter when discomfort presses close. The Book of Jasher says that as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the people began to forget what they had seen. They forgot the blood in the Nile, the darkness in Egypt, the cries in the night. The sea split open before them, the army swallowed behind them. Memory shrank under the weight of immediate need. Hunger and thirst began to speak louder than miracle. A month after leaving Egypt, they came into the wilderness of Sin, and there the whole congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. In their bitterness, they said it would have been better to die in Egypt, where at least they had sat beside pots of meat and eaten bread until they were full. Now, they said, Moses had brought them into the wilderness only to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Moses grieved over their complaint, but the Lord answered with mercy. He declared that he would rain bread from heaven for them. Every day they were to go out and gather enough for that day, no more, no less. It would feed them, but it would also test them, revealing whether they would trust the Lord for daily provision. That evening quail covered the camp in such numbers that the people could gather them by hand. And in the morning, when the dew lifted, there lay upon the ground a fine substance, delicate as frost, strange and unfamiliar. The people looked at it and asked what it was. Moses told them it was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. They called it manna. It tasted like wafers made with honey, simple yet sufficient, heaven's provision appearing with the dawn. Day after day it came. Evening after evening the quail returned. For 40 years the Lord sustained them this way, never too much, never too little, always enough for that day. But even daily bread did not cure the deeper sickness in their hearts. At Rephidim they quarreled again, because there was no water. They accused Moses of bringing them and their children and their livestock out of Egypt, only to let them die of thirst. Moses cried out to God in distress, fearing the people were close to stoning him. Then the Lord commanded him to go ahead of the people, take the staff with which he had struck the Nile, and strike the rock at Horeb. Moses obeyed, and water burst forth in abundance, a torrent strong enough for the entire camp and all their flocks. Even stone gave drink when the Lord commanded it, yet still the people struggled to trust. After 3 months in the wilderness, they came to Mount Sinai. The mountain rose before them high, terrible, wrapped in smoke and fire. Thunder rolled from its height. Lightning broke across its face. The ground trembled beneath their feet. There the Lord summoned Moses upward, and in the presence of cloud and flame God spoke the 10 Commandments. He declared himself as the Lord their God who had brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. They were to have no other gods before him. They were not to make idols. They were not to take his name in vain. They were to remember the Sabbath, honor father and mother, and turn away from murder, adultery, theft, false witness, and covetousness. The people heard the voice of God and were overwhelmed with fear. They drew back and pleaded with Moses to stand between them and that terrible holiness. "Let Moses speak to them," they said, and they would listen. But if God continued to speak directly, they feared they would die. So Moses entered the thick darkness where God was. There the Lord gave not only the commandments, but the statutes, ordinances, and instructions by which Israel was to live as a holy nation, set apart from the peoples around them. He remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. And the Lord himself wrote the commandments on 2 tablets of stone with his own finger. But while Moses was in the presence of God above, restlessness and corruption spread below. The people looked at the mountain, looked at the delay, and decided that waiting was intolerable. They came to Aaron and demanded visible gods to go before them. Because, as for Moses, the man who had led them from Egypt, they did not know what had become of him. Aaron, weak before the pressure of the people, gave way. He told them to bring the gold earrings of their households. They gave him the gold, and he melted it down and fashioned it into the image of a calf. Then the people bowed before it and uttered words of horror. These, they said, were their gods, the ones who had brought them up out of Egypt. They built an altar, they offered sacrifice, they ate, drank, and gave themselves over to revelry. Jasher makes the tragedy plain. This was not an innocent mistake by an ignorant people. This was betrayal within sight of Sinai, idolatry committed in the shadow of a mountain, still burning with the fire of God. On the mountain, the Lord told Moses to go down quickly, because the people had corrupted themselves and turned aside from the way he had commanded. Moses descended, carrying the 2 tablets. As he neared the camp, he heard singing, shouting, and dancing. When he saw the calf and the people bowing before it, anger blazed within him. He cast the tablets from his hands, and they shattered at the foot of the mountain, a visible sign of the covenant broken almost as soon as it had been given. Then he seized the calf, burned it with fire, ground it into powder, scattered it upon water, and made the people drink it. Their idol would become their humiliation. After that, Moses stood at the gate of the camp and called out for those who were on the Lord's side to come to him. The sons of Levi gathered around him. Then came one of the most severe judgments in the wilderness story. Moses commanded them, in the name of the Lord, to go through the camp with swords and strike down brother, friend, and neighbor where necessary. About 3,000 men fell that day. It was terrible, but it was not senseless. Idolatry was not a small sickness that could be tolerated until it passed. It was a corruption that, if left alive, would consume the whole nation from within. The cancer had to be cut out, or the body would die. Yet even after judgment, Moses' heart broke for the people. He went back up the mountain and pleaded for them before the Lord. He asked that their sin might be forgiven, and if not, that his own name be blotted out of God's book, rather than see them utterly destroyed. It was the prayer of a shepherd willing to stand in the gap for a rebellious flock, a foreshadowing of a greater mediator yet to come. And the Lord answered with both justice and mercy. The guilty would bear their guilt, yet his purpose for Israel would continue. But the Lord said to Moses that the journey must go on. He was to lead the people forward to the place God had promised, and the angel of the Lord would go before them. Moses came down from the mountain carrying new tablets, and the covenant was renewed. Yet something had changed forever in the hearts of the people. They had learned, through terror and mercy, that while God's compassion is vast beyond measure, His holiness is not something to be treated lightly. He forgives, yes. He restores, yes. But those who turn from Him and harden themselves in rebellion do not escape judgment forever. So the camp moved on from Sinai, northward, step by step, toward the land of promise. When they drew near, 12 spies were sent ahead into Canaan to search out the land. For 40 days they moved through its valleys, its hills, its fortified towns, and its fertile fields. When they returned, they carried evidence of the land's abundance, a cluster of grapes so large that it had to be borne on a pole between 2 men. It truly was a land flowing with milk and honey. But 10 of the spies returned with fear in their mouths. They spoke of powerful people, walled cities, and giants in the land. They said they had seemed like grasshoppers in their own eyes, and therefore must have seemed the same to their enemies. Only Joshua and Caleb spoke differently. They said the land was exceedingly good, and if the Lord delighted in His people, He would surely bring them in and give it to them. They urged the people not to fear, because the Lord was with them. But fear spreads faster than faith when hearts are weak, and the people chose fear. They wept through the night. They complained against Moses and Aaron. They spoke of appointing another leader and returning to Egypt, as though slavery behind them had somehow become more desirable than trust before them. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes in grief, pleading with the people not to rebel, but the congregation answered by talking of stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting, and God spoke with grief and anger, asking how long this people would despise Him, how long they would refuse to believe despite all the signs He had done among them. Once again Moses pleaded for mercy, and once again the Lord restrained complete destruction. But judgment still came. Not one of the men who had seen His glory in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet tested Him again and again, would enter the land sworn to their fathers. The children they feared would become prey, would be the very ones God would bring in. But that unbelieving generation would fall in the wilderness. And so the years stretched out. 40 years of wandering. For the 40 days the spies had searched the land. The generation that came out of Egypt one by one died beneath the desert sky. Only Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful witnesses, remained alive to see the promise draw near. Even Moses himself would not be permitted to enter. At Meribah, when the people once more quarreled over water, God told Moses to speak to the rock. But worn down by years of complaint and anger, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff instead. Water came out in abundance, and the people drank, but the act cost him dearly. Because he had not trusted God enough to honor Him as holy before the people, Moses was told that he would not lead the assembly into the land. It was one of the saddest sentences in all of the story. The man who had stood before Pharaoh lifted the staff over the sea, climbed the mountain into fire and cloud, and carried a rebellious people through the wilderness, would see the promise from a distance, but would not cross into it himself. Yet Moses did not turn bitter. He did not refuse the road because he would not enjoy its final destination. He continued to lead. He continued to teach. He continued to prepare the people for the future beyond his own life. And when his time came, he climbed Mount Nebo and looked out across the land of Canaan, the valleys, rivers, hills, and plains stretching before him like a vision held just beyond the reach of his hands. There the Lord showed him the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and told him that though he had seen it with his eyes, he would not pass over into it. On that mountain Moses died. The Book of Jasher says that God Himself buried him, and to this day no man knows the place of his grave. Israel mourned him for 30 days. Then, under Joshua, they prepared at last to cross the Jordan. 40 years of wandering, 40 years of discipline, 40 years of learning that faith is not a feeling but obedience under pressure, and now the wilderness lay behind them. The promise stood ahead, and waiting beyond the Jordan was another impossible miracle. another day when heaven and earth would bend beneath the word of the Lord. Chapter 10. Joshua's battles. After Moses died, Israel stood at the edge of the Jordan River. Beyond it lay the land promised to their fathers, a land of vineyards and olive groves, hills and valleys, pasture land and cities, rich with everything God had pledged to give them. But it was not empty land waiting peacefully to be occupied. It was filled with fortified strongholds, armed kings, seasoned warriors, and nations with no intention of surrendering what they held. Into that tension the Lord spoke to Joshua. Moses, his servant, was dead, but the mission was not. Joshua was to rise, cross the Jordan with all the people, and take possession of the land. Every place the sole of their foot would tread had already been given to them, just as God had promised Moses. No man would be able to stand against Joshua all the days of his life, because the same God who had been with Moses would now be with him. He would not leave him or forsake him. Therefore Joshua was told to be strong and courageous. Joshua listened. His heart surely trembled beneath the weight of what lay ahead, but he believed. The Book of Jasher says he commanded the officers to pass through the camp and tell the people to prepare provisions, because within 3 days they would cross the Jordan and take possession of the land the Lord was giving them. The people answered with loyalty, promising to obey Joshua just as they had obeyed Moses, and praying only that the Lord their God would be with him as he had been with Moses. Then Joshua sent 2 spies across the river into Jericho. They entered the house of Rahab, a woman who lived in the wall of the city. But the king of Jericho heard that Israelite spies had come and sent men to seize them. Rahab hid the spies on her roof beneath stalks of flax and misdirected the soldiers, telling them the men had already left at dusk and urging them to hurry if they hoped to catch them. When the soldiers were gone, Rahab went up to the roof and spoke with the spies. Her words revealed that fear had already entered Jericho before Israel ever touched its gates. She said she knew the Lord had given them the land. The people of the city had heard what the Lord did at the Red Sea when Israel came out of Egypt, and what had been done to the kings of the Amorites. Their hearts had melted, courage had drained out of them. Rahab confessed something astonishing for a woman of Jericho to say. The Lord, Israel's God, was God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Then she asked for mercy. Because she had dealt kindly with the spies, she begged that kindness might be shown to her father's house when the city fell. The spies swore an oath. If she tied a scarlet cord in the window and gathered her family into her house, all within would be spared when the attack came. She lowered them by rope through the window, because her house stood within the city wall, and they escaped. When they returned to Joshua and told him all that had happened, he knew the Lord had already gone before them. The hearts of their enemies were melting before a single sword had been raised. The next morning Joshua ordered the camp to move. They came to the Jordan at flood stage, in the season when the river overflowed its banks, swift, full, and dangerous. But Joshua instructed the priests to take up the Ark of the Covenant and go ahead of the people. The priests lifted the Ark onto their shoulders and walked toward the river. And the moment their feet touched the edge of the water, the river stopped. Upstream, the waters gathered in a heap. Downstream, they were cut off. The riverbed opened into dry ground. The priests stood in the middle of the Jordan holding the ark, while all Israel passed across, just as their fathers had crossed the Red Sea decades before. And when the last person reached the far side, Joshua told the priests to come up out of the river. The instant their feet stepped onto the western bank, the waters rushed back into place, and the Jordan overflowed its banks once more. At Gilgal, Joshua set up 12 stones taken from the riverbed as a memorial, so that future generations would remember the day God stopped the Jordan and brought his people into the land. Jericho now stood shut tight, sealed in fear. No one went out. No one came in. The city had heard what happened at the Jordan, and terror had made its gates into prison doors. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua and told him that Jericho, its king, and its mighty men had already been given into his hand. But the strategy God gave him was unlike any human battle plan. The men of war were to march around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests were to carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day they were to march around the city 7 times, and when the trumpets gave a long blast, all the people were to shout. Then the wall of the city would collapse, and every man would go straight up into it. No siege engines, no ladders, no battering rams, only obedience, silence, and faith. So for 6 days they marched, armed men in front, priests with trumpets, the ark of the Lord behind them, and the rear guard after that. The priests blew the horns, but the people said nothing. They did not shout, they did not taunt the city. They simply walked in silence and returned to camp. From the walls of Jericho, the people watched, confused and increasingly afraid. What kind of army does not attack when it arrives? What kind of commander circles a city in silence and leaves? Their questions must have deepened with every day. Then came the 7th day. At dawn, Israel rose early and marched around the city not once, but 7 times. And on the 7th circuit, when the priests sounded the long blast on the trumpets, Joshua gave the command. The people shouted, because the Lord had given them the city. And the Book of Jasher says that the shout rolled like thunder, like the roar of a sea in storm, like the voice of heaven itself. Then the walls of Jericho collapsed. Those ancient, towering walls, which generations had trusted, fell straight down into ruin. The city lay open. Israel surged forward, every man straight ahead, and they took it. Only Rahab and her family were spared, because when fear ruled Jericho, she chose faith. She had hidden the spies, trusted the God of Israel before the city ever fell, and tied the scarlet cord in her window as a sign that mercy would find her when judgment came. So Joshua's men brought her out, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her, and they were given a place among the people of Israel. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that even in conquest, God was not blind to mercy. Jericho was only the beginning. It was the first great stronghold to fall, the first public sign that the land promised to Abraham was no longer a distant hope, but a reality unfolding city by city, battle by battle, step by step beneath the hand of God. From Jericho, Joshua led Israel onward through the land. There was Ai, where Israel first tasted the bitter consequence of hidden sin, and then, after judgment and repentance, saw victory restored. There were the Gibeonites, who came not with swords, but with deception, pretending to be travelers from a distant land. Their clothes were worn, their bread dry, their words carefully crafted, and Israel made covenant with them without first seeking the counsel of the Lord. It was a costly lesson. Even a people led by God can be deceived when they begin to move in their own confidence. Yet the treaty stood, and when the kings of Canaan heard what had happened, when they heard that Jericho had fallen and that Gibeon had made peace with Israel, fear spread through the land like fire through dry grass. Then 5 Amorite kings formed an alliance, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. They gathered their armies and marched against Gibeon, determined to destroy the city for choosing peace with Israel. The Gibeonites sent desperate word to Joshua, pleading with him not to abandon them, but to come quickly and save them, because all the kings of the hill country had gathered against them. Joshua did not hesitate. Though the covenant had been secured through trickery, his word still bound him, and more than that, the Lord had already declared what would happen. So Joshua gathered his army, his strongest warriors, his battle-tested men, and they marched all night from Gilgal to Gibeon, covering the distance in darkness, driven by urgency, discipline, and the confidence that the Lord was with them. And the Lord spoke to Joshua before the clash. He told him not to fear those kings, because they had already been given into his hands. Not one of them, God said, would be able to stand before him. So Joshua came upon them suddenly, arriving after the night march with the force of surprise still in his favor. The enemy was thrown into confusion. Panic spread through their ranks. Their alliance, forged in fear, began to fracture under the pressure of divine judgment. They fled before Israel, racing down the road from Beth Horon, trying to escape the fury descending upon them. And as they ran, the Lord himself entered the battle in a way that left no doubt who was truly winning the war. Great hailstones began to fall from heaven, crashing down upon the Amorites. More died by those stones from the sky than by the swords of Israel. The battlefield had become more than a contest of armies. Heaven itself had joined the fight. But even as victory unfolded, the light began to fail. The day was dying, the sun sank lower, and Joshua saw what that meant. If darkness came too soon, the enemy would scatter into caves, forests, ravines, and distant strongholds. They would survive the day, regroup by night, and return later to threaten Israel again. A victory that could have been total would become only partial. Joshua understood the weight of the moment. He had seen too much already to believe that God was limited by what limits men. He remembered Moses stretching out the staff over the Red Sea. He remembered the Jordan stopping before the ark. He remembered Jericho's walls falling not before siege engines, but before obedience and a shout. The God who had done all of that was still the same. And if the Lord ruled the sea, the river, the wall, the storm, and the nations, then he ruled the heavens too. So Joshua stood beneath the open sky in the middle of battle, sword in hand, breath heavy in his chest, the noise of war all around him. And he did something no man before him had dared to do. He prayed, but not the sort of prayer men whisper from safety. Not a timid request wrapped in hesitation. What came from Joshua was a declaration of faith so fierce, so unguarded, so absolute, that it seemed to strike the boundary between heaven and earth. Chapter 11. The day the sun stood still. The battle stretched across the hills around Gibeon. The armies of the 5 Amorite kings were broken and retreating, tumbling down the steep descent toward Beth-horon in desperate disorder. Israel pursued them with relentless force. The Lord had already thrown them into confusion, and Joshua knew this was the moment to finish what heaven had begun. But the sun was sinking. He stood upon the height and watched the enemy vanish into lengthening shadow. He and his men had fought all day, and the victory was already astonishing. But astonishing was not enough. If night covered the field, the enemy would escape into the protection of darkness. They would disappear into mountain caves, wooded ravines, and fortified cities, and the decisive triumph that lay within reach would slip into an unfinished war. Joshua felt the full pressure of that hour. This was not only about tactics, it was about timing, about obedience, about whether the people of God would stop short when total victory was possible. And so his mind turned to all the mighty acts the Lord had already done. He thought of Moses standing at the sea while the waters split before Israel and swallowed Egypt behind them. He thought of the Jordan piling up when the priests stepped into it. He thought of Jericho collapsing in an instant at the sound of trumpets and a shout. And he understood something that only faith can truly understand. Time itself belonged to God. The passing of hours, the movement of the sun, the rise of the moon, the very rhythm of creation, none of it was outside the authority of the one who spoke the world into being. The Book of Jasher says Joshua lifted his eyes to the heavens. The sun hung low over Gibeon, a blazing disk leaning toward the west. The moon, pale and already visible, stood over the valley of Ajalon. Daylight was slipping away. Yet Joshua knew that if God willed it, even the heavens could be made to wait. So he stepped forward and raised his voice, not to his men, but to the sky itself. His words rang across the battlefield, clear enough for every Israelite to hear, bold enough to stop the breath of everyone who heard them. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon, over the valley of Ajalon. Then came a stillness so sharp it must have felt unnatural. The soldiers paused. The wind itself seemed to hold back. The fleeing enemy, though still far off, must have sensed that something beyond human war had entered the day. And then the impossible happened. The sun stopped. Not slowly, not as though clouds delayed the eye, or some illusion softened the moment, but suddenly, decisively, as though the hand of God himself had reached into the machinery of the heavens and held it still. Jasher says the sun stood in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. The light remained. The shadows stopped growing. The day did not end. The warriors of Israel looked up in disbelief, shading their eyes against a brightness that should have been fading, yet burned on with the strength of midday. Hours passed, and still the sun did not move. The moon remained suspended as well, fixed in its place like silver pinned against the sky. It was as though time itself had been commanded to wait, and time had obeyed. Joshua's prayer had not risen into silence. It had been answered in the language of creation itself. Under that unmoving sun, the battle continued. Israel pressed forward with renewed strength. There was no darkness for the enemy to hide in, no night to conceal retreat, no shelter in shadow. The light held, and under that impossible light the enemies of God fell by the thousands. Jasher describes the day as unlike any other before or after it. Hailstones still crashed from heaven upon the fleeing Amorites. Israel's sword still rose and fell. The king's armies broke apart in terror, and all the while above them the sun remained motionless, a burning witness that the God of Israel was not merely stronger than men, but sovereign over the very order of the universe. Men have tried to shrink that day down, to explain it away, to make it an eclipse, a mirage, a poetic flourish, a legend inflated by memory. But the witness preserved in Joshua and echoed in Jasher does not speak with uncertainty. It speaks plainly. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky. It delayed going down for about a full day. Not a symbol, not a metaphor. A day extended by the will of God, because a man of faith asked for what only God could give. And that is what makes the moment so staggering. The Creator of time bent time itself in answer to prayer. The laws that govern the heavens were not broken by accident or strained by natural force. They were held in suspension by the one who made them. The earth's turning, the measure of hours, the march toward evening, all of it paused, because Joshua believed that nothing was too hard for the Lord. It was not Joshua's greatness that held the sun still. It was God's power meeting Joshua's faith. And in that union of divine authority and human obedience, history witnessed a day no generation could ever forget. By the time the light finally began to soften, by the time the sun at last resumed its descent toward the western hills, the battle was finished. The enemy had been crushed. The 5 Amorite kings had fled and hidden themselves in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua ordered the mouth of the cave sealed with large stones and guards set over it, but he would not let the pursuit lose momentum. He commanded his men not to stop, not to turn aside, not to allow the survivors to slip back into their cities, because the Lord had delivered them into Israel's hand. What had begun as a night march had become a day stretched beyond nature itself, and by the end of it the land had seen a revelation. No empire, no king, and no future skeptic could easily silence. When the God of Israel acts, even the sun waits. And so the army pressed forward, cutting down the remnants of the enemy until their resistance was broken beyond recovery. A few survivors managed to flee into fortified cities, but they no longer posed any serious threat. When the pursuit was finished, Joshua returned to the cave at Makkedah. He ordered the stones rolled away and commanded that the 5 kings be brought out, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. They emerged trembling, stripped of all the terror they had once inspired, their royal garments torn and stained, their faces pale with the knowledge that the God of Israel had handed them over. Joshua then summoned the men of Israel and called the commanders of the army to come forward. He told them to place their feet on the necks of those kings, and they did. There, in full view of the army, the mighty were laid low beneath the feet of men who only days before had been marching through enemy land by faith alone. Joshua used that moment not merely as a display of victory, but as a lesson for the future. He told them not to fear or be dismayed, but to be strong and courageous, because in the same way the Lord had subdued these kings, he would do the same to every enemy who rose against them. Then Joshua struck the kings down and put them to death. Their bodies were hung on 5 trees until evening, and at sunset he ordered them taken down and thrown back into the very cave where they had hidden. Great stones were placed over its entrance, and they remained there as a witness long afterward. The Book of Jasher says that after this victory, Joshua swept through the entire southern region of Canaan in a single campaign. From Makkedah to Libnah, from Lachish to Eglon, from Hebron to Debir, city after city fell before Israel. Not because Israel had become some invincible army in itself, not because their weapons were unmatched or their numbers overwhelming, but because the Lord was fighting for them. Later the northern kings, led by Jabin, king of Hazor, heard what had happened in the south, and gathered an even greater force, horses, chariots, warriors in numbers like the sand along the seashore. They assembled by the waters of Merom, prepared to crush Israel in a single decisive strike. But once again the Lord spoke to Joshua, telling him not to fear, because by the next day he would deliver them all slain before Israel. Joshua was commanded to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire, cutting off the very military strength in which those kings trusted most. Joshua came upon them suddenly, and the Lord gave them into Israel's hand. They were struck down until none remained. Joshua did exactly as he had been told. The horses were disabled. The chariots were burned. The strength of the nations was reduced to ash because the God of Israel had decided the outcome before the battle even began. Jasher summarizes the conquest with a sweeping force that leaves no doubt where the victory came from. Joshua took the hill country, the Negev, the lowland, the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. From Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, from Goshen to Gibeon, the land fell in one campaign because the Lord fought for Israel. Yet above all the conquests, above all the fallen walls, shattered armies, and defeated kings, one moment stood higher than the rest, one prayer, one impossible miracle. One day, when the order of creation itself bent at the command of God, in answer to the faith of his servant, the day the sun stood still. Scripture says it plainly. There has been no day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. Think about that, with the weight it deserves. The creator of the universe, the one who set the sun on its course, who appointed the moon its place, who established the turning of the earth and the measure of the days, listened to the voice of a man. Not because Joshua was flawless, not because he possessed power in himself, but because he believed. He believed that the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt, split the sea, fed them with manna, brought water from the rock, stopped the Jordan, and collapsed the walls of Jericho, was still the same God on the battlefield at Gibeon. And because Joshua believed, he dared to ask for what only God could do, and God answered. The Book of Jasher closes its account of that miracle with the line that has echoed through all these centuries. Is this not written in the Book of Jasher? Yes, it is written, and it stands as a witness to every generation that faith is not fantasy, not vague optimism, not spiritual sentiment stretched over human weakness. Faith is confidence, clear-eyed, costly, unshakable confidence that when God has spoken, he will do what he said. Joshua did not stop the sun by his own strength. The sun stopped because he asked the one who governs all strength, all power, all creation. And the Lord, in his faithfulness, said yes. After the conquest, the land was divided among the tribes of Israel. Each family received its inheritance, fields, vineyards, towns, grazing lands, cities, once held by enemies and now placed in the hands of those who had wandered so long in hope alone. The people who had spent 40 years in the wilderness, who had been born in tents, raised on stories of a land they had never seen, now lived in houses with foundations. They planted vineyards. They gathered fruit from trees they had not planted. Their children ran through streets that once belonged to those who stood against the promise of God. At last, what had been spoken to Abraham generations before had become visible reality. Joshua, old now and bowed with years, gathered the people at Shechem between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. His hair had turned white. His body carried the weight of long labor, but his voice remained strong. He reminded Israel of everything the Lord had done, from the call of Abraham out of idolatry, to the deliverance from Egypt, to the wilderness, the Jordan, and the conquest of Canaan. Then he called them to the choice that lies at the center of every covenant life. They were to fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. They were to put away the gods their fathers had served beyond the river and in Egypt. And then came the words that have rung across generations. If it seemed evil to them to serve the Lord, then they were to choose that day whom they would serve. But as for Joshua and his house, they would serve the Lord. The people answered with fervor, declaring that far be it from them to forsake the Lord and serve other gods, because it was the Lord their God who had brought them and their fathers up from Egypt, out of slavery, and preserved them all the way they had gone. Therefore they too would serve the Lord, because he was their God. Joshua then set up a great stone beneath the oak near the sanctuary of the Lord, and declared that the stone itself would stand as a witness against them. It had heard, he said, all the words the Lord had spoken, and therefore it would testify if they dealt falsely with their God. Not long after, Joshua died at the age of 110 years. He was buried in the land of his inheritance, and the people mourned him. Jasher closes its account of Joshua with a beautiful and weighty summary. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived him, and had known all the work the Lord had done for Israel. But the deeper truth that runs like a golden thread through every page of Jasher is greater still. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does not change. He is not diminished by time. He does not weaken with the passing of generations. He does not forget. He does not abandon his promises. The God who stopped the sun once could do so again if he chose, because nothing is too difficult for the Lord. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Jasher. The Book of Jasher closes its historical account with the death of Joshua and the settling of the tribes in the Promised Land. But its legacy reaches much farther than the final page. For centuries, this book was treasured by those who understood that faith is not built out of cold abstractions or polished symbols, but out of real men and women walking real roads, facing impossible circumstances, and choosing to trust a God they could not see. And then it faded. Not because it was worthless, not because it contradicted the sacred story, but because it showed too much. It stripped away the distance. It refused to turn the patriarchs into untouchable icons. It showed Abraham, Moses, and Joshua as flesh and blood, fearful at times, flawed at times, struggling, stumbling, waiting, doubting, yet still moving forward because the voice of God had called them. It preserved the details that make the miracles feel not symbolic, but shockingly real. It showed the exact place where human weakness met divine power. For generations, it was safer for many to keep only the summaries, safer to preserve the outlines and let the edges soften, safer to leave the difficult questions unanswered, the raw humanity blurred, the wonder less immediate. But truth has a way of surviving burial. And when the Book of Jasher was rediscovered and translated into English, it reminded the world of something many had nearly forgotten beneath layers of ritual, distance, and repetition. God is not remote. He is near. He speaks. He acts. And he does not wait for perfection before he calls a person into his purpose. He asks for faith. Tonight we have walked through these pages together, from the closing gates of Eden to the plains of Gibeon, from Adam's exile to Joshua's victory. And through every chapter, one truth has remained unbroken. God keeps his promises, every one of them. He promised Adam that a Redeemer would come through the seed of the woman, and that promise moved forward through the generations. He promised Noah the earth would never again be destroyed by flood, and the rainbow still stands as witness. He promised Abraham a son in old age, and Isaac was born. He promised to bring Israel out of Egypt, and the sea parted. He promised Joshua victory, and the sun stood still. Not one promise failed, not one. We have seen that miracles are not myths softened by time. Abraham walked out of the furnace untouched. Moses lifted his staff, and the sea made way. Joshua spoke toward heaven, and the day itself lengthened at the command of God. These were not decorative symbols. They were moments when creation bowed to its creator. We have also learned that faith is never passive. It is active, bold, costly, and at times almost audacious. Abraham left everything familiar. Moses stood before Pharaoh. Joshua commanded the sun to stop not because he was arrogant, but because he trusted completely that the God who made the sun governed it still. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: the God who did those things has not changed. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What he did for them reveals who he is for you. The Book of Jasher is like a mirror held up to the soul. When we read of Abraham's faith, we also see our own hesitation. When we hear Israel grumbling in the wilderness, we recognize the sound of our own distrust. When we watch Joshua stand in the middle of a battlefield and ask for the impossible, we feel exposed by all the prayers we have been too afraid to speak. But that is precisely where the book speaks most powerfully. You do not need to be perfect to be used by God. Abraham led. Moses killed a man. Israel complained again and again. Joshua led a people who often trembled more than they trusted. Yet when they turned toward God, even imperfectly, even fearfully, he moved heaven and earth on their behalf. And he still does. That is the real legacy of Jasher. Not merely that it tells old stories in fuller detail, but that it confronts us with the reality that the God of those stories is still alive, still faithful, still attentive to the cries of his people. The same power that held the sun in place belongs to him now, not because we deserve it, not because we have earned anything, but because he is faithful, merciful, and full of steadfast love. The Book of Jasher was feared by some because it makes the miracles feel uncomfortably close. It suggests that the God who acted then is not locked away in the past. He is present. He is listening. He is still the God who answers. So tonight, as you let the weight of the day begin to fall away, remember this: the God who stopped the sun for Joshua is watching over you right now. The same faithfulness that kept Abraham, sustained Moses, and fought for Joshua has not run dry. The voice that called them is still calling people to trust, to rest, to believe, and to walk forward one step at a time. You may never part a sea or bring down a city wall, but you can take the next step of obedience. You can whisper the next prayer. You can trust him in the next moment, and that is not a small thing. Because when even small faith meets the faithfulness of God, miracles happen not always in the way we imagine, not always in the timing we demand, but always in ways that reveal his glory and draw us deeper into his care. The story of Jasher has come to its close, but your story has not. The same God who guided Abraham, delivered Moses, and answered Joshua is still writing lives, still leading hearts, still carrying his people through fire, wilderness, battle, and waiting. So let go now. Let go of the weight you have been carrying. Let go of the fear that tells you your situation is too far gone. Let go of the doubt that whispers that God has forgotten you. The one who holds the sun in its place holds you in his hand, and he will not let you go. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, Lord of heaven and earth, we come before you with grateful hearts. Thank you for preserving these stories of your faithfulness. Thank you for Abraham, for Moses, for Joshua, imperfect people who trusted you and saw you do what no human power could accomplish. We confess that our faith is often weak. We doubt, we fear, we grow weary. Forgive us for living as though you were far away when you have always been near. Tonight, remind us of who you are. When we stand before our own Red Seas, teach us to remember that you still make a way where none can be seen. When walls rise in front of us, teach us to trust that you can bring them down. When battles stretch long and the light feels like it is fading, give us the courage to pray, as Joshua prayed, with boldness, with surrender, with confidence that you hear and answer. We place ourselves in your hands now, our burdens, our fears, our unanswered questions, our tomorrow. Quiet our minds. Guard our hearts. Give us peace as we rest. And when morning comes, renew our strength so that we may rise again and walk by faith. For you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You are the God who stopped the sun. And you are our God, now and forever. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.